The heart stopped between two beats of the wheels against rocks. The cart shook over the bumpy road. My hands were bound behind her back with a rope. The rain pounded on face. And in that moment, Aidan Crow died. He simply died. His stopped quietly and ordinarily. 7 years of acid fumes made done work. But her death went on exactly 1 second. That's that in next second, in his head, something foreign. Not a voice, not vision, just knowledge. Enormous and detailed, as if someone had poured it into a skull, a whole library. Formulas, proportions, names of substances, methods of metals, drawings of mechanisms. Everything this came at once and subsided on the cart so firmly, as if it had always there. Aidan opened his eyes. He took a breath. The rain was still pelted on face. The cart still was shaking. But he began different. He didn't realize just how much. The guard on the goats turned around and muttered that the condemned man's still alive, and that good, because throwing away a corpse into swamp is not part in order. The second guard spat and said that the bridge it was half an hour, and what this alchemist wilt him a cloak for a month in advance. Aidan didn't listen to them. He looked into gray sky and thought. I thought differently. Before, he had thought the proportions of gunpowder in parts per eyes. Now he knew them to hundredths. Before, he had guessed that nitrate could be purified by recrystallization. Now he saw the entire process. Boiling, filtration, cooling, crystal of crystals. And not just nitrate. He suddenly knew how cast bronze barrels with a core. He knew that this had a caliber. I knew how calculate the thickness of the bew so that the barrel doesn't tear into 5th shot. Where did he... He couldn't answer. But the knowledge was in him firmly. Just a bone under the skin. The cart came to a stop. The guard jumped off from the blaze and cut the rope at his wrists. Aidan fell onto the wet ground. His knees hit against the clay. My hands went numb and wouldn't obeyed me. The guard threw him at his bag. He said that there was bread and that this has the last act of the crown. The second guard didn't turn around. The wagon turned around and drove back down the road. The wheels churned the mud. The sound grew quieter, then faded completely. Aidan was left alone. In front of him stood a half-rotten bridge across a narrow little river. Across the bridge, 4 yard, the blacksmith shop with a slanted roof. Chapel with faded sign of the most holy flame above the door. Smoke from one chimney. Village Ternovi Brod, the Mecca of the world. A place where people those who are not no longer kill, only because that murder was too more expensive. Aidan stood up. His fingers were trembling. He looked at his hands. Burned, bandaged with dirty rags. Nails on 3 fingers on the hand had been more in the cell. His hands of the Mecca of the college. The authors of the author of the treatise on pure salts and slow combustion. A treatise which will be signed in someone else's name. 7 years of service. 3 dissertations. Laboratory with copper distillation cubes. Students who are forbidden to say his name. All this was taken by a decree of the square. Master Crow was caught of conspiracy with the evil one, fire. Property in the treasury, the body into the swamp. Aidan clenched his fists. The pain in his nails shot might all the way to elbow. He stood and, breathing. He was simply breathing. A minute. 2. Anger came, not right away. It welled up from somewhere from my stomach. Dark. Heavy. Not hot. cold. Anselm isn't just took his job, he took his gunpowder. That very sample. Notebooks with formulas, results from 3 months of experiments. Aidan showed the king a grain that produced in 3 times more energy than a standard grey powder. The king smiled. He took notebooks, and a week read out the decree. That's that Anselm was smart. Smart enough to realize that a man who makes such gunpowder is more dangerous than any mage, and vain enough to want that gunpowder for himself, without the Creator. But Anselm failed to take one thing into account. Notebooks are just paper. Paper without the mind that wrote it is just ink. And that mind was now standing by the bridge in Ternovi Broad, thinking with a strange, cold calm. Saltpeter. Saltpeter in the manure piles. Potash in the ashes. He'll make charcoal from willow. Sulfur can be found at the southern fairs. It's all here. Right here. Aidan looked up and saw movement behind the wattle fence of the nearest yard. A girl, about 12 years old, barefoot despite the cold. She held a basket of bulbs in her hands.
She looked at him, not with fear, but with curiosity,
the way one looks at a beast they're seeing for the first time. Aidan tried to smile, but his lips wouldn't cooperate. He asked for water. The girl set the basket on the ground, went behind the fence, and returned a minute later with a clay mug. She handed it to him without a word. The water was cold and clear. Aidan drank and felt life returning to his body, one sip after another. He asked her name. "Taya," the girl said. "Taya West." He asked if there was a village headman. Taya nodded and pointed to a house with a smoking chimney. Aidan returned the mug. He thanked her. He walked toward the village headman's house. He walked slowly. His legs wouldn't hold him up. But his mind was working. His mind was working like never before. The village headman turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s with a stern face and wary eyes. He opened the door and stared at Aidan for a long time. At his dirty clothes, at his bandaged hands, at his gaunt face with sunken eyes. He asked who he was and where he was from. Aidan said he was an alchemist, that he'd been exiled by decree of the crown, that he wasn't asking for much, just a roof over his head and the chance to work with his hands. He could repair things. He could treat livestock. He could make useful concoctions. The village elder was silent. Then he asked if he was the same alchemist mentioned in the decree read at the fair in Medni Kholm, the one about impure fire and a pact with darkness. Aidan replied that he was indeed that very man. The village elder scratched his beard. He looked up at the sky. There was a month left until winter. Snow could fall any day. A man without a roof over his head wouldn't last even a week. The village headman said there was an empty barn next to the blacksmith's shop in the village. If the alchemist agreed to sleep on straw and not bother people with talk of fire, then he could stay. But if the church came asking, the village wouldn't know him. Aidan nodded. That was enough. The shed turned out to be small and cold. The roof leaked in 2 places. The floor was dirt. But the walls kept the wind out. In the corner lay a bundle of old straw. Aidan sat down on it and, for the first time in a week, exhaled calmly. He took some bread out of his canvas bag. Stale, gray, a royal handout. He ate slowly. He chewed each bite for a long time because his jaw ached from the interrogation. And as he ate, he thought. Not about revenge, not about justice, about manure piles. He'd seen 2 behind the blacksmith shop on his way to the village elder's house. Big ones. old ones, rotten ones. Nitrate accumulates over the years in rotting manure, a white coating on the barn walls, salty crystals on the stones by the livestock yard. That's potassium nitrate. Dirty, impure. But if you dissolve it in boiling water, filter it through ash, and then let it cool slowly, pure white crystals will settle at the bottom. And that would be the first step. In the morning, Aidan went out into the yard. It was cold. Steam rose from his mouth. He walked around the village. 4 households. 17 people, counting the children. The blacksmith shop was open. The blacksmith was a silent, broad-shouldered man named Orden. He was forging a horseshoe and didn't look up when Aidan stopped at the entrance. Aidan surveyed the blacksmith shop with a professional eye. The bellows are good. The anvil is old but sturdy. The tools are meager. The bellows are full of holes, but it's workable. He asked the blacksmith if there was a cast iron cauldron in the village. Orden grumbled that there was one. It was full of holes. Aidan said he'd fix it. Orden looked up for the first time. He looked at the alchemist's thin, sunburnt hands. He grunted. But he handed over the cauldron. Aidan spent his first week quietly. He repaired the cauldron. He patched the shed's roof. He helped the widow Tay carry water. He kept to himself. He didn't say more than necessary. The village was getting used to him slowly, just as they get used to a stray dog that doesn't bite. But every evening, when the village fell asleep, Aidan worked. He scraped the white coating off the barn walls. He collected it in clay bowls. He dissolved it in boiling water in the repaired cauldron. He filtered it through a rag stuffed with ash. He set the solution out in the cold, and he waited. On the 5th day, he saw the first crystals at the bottom of the bowl. White, pure, needle-like. He placed a single crystal on his tongue. A bitter, salty taste. A chill. It was it. Potassium nitrate. Pure. He sat in the dark shed, holding the bowl of crystals in his hands. Behind the wall, someone's livestock was snoring. The wind whistled through the cracks, and for the first time ever, Aidan Crow smiled genuinely. Not out of joy, out of understanding. Anselm had cast him out, taken his notebooks, taken his lab, taken his name, but he hadn't taken his mind. And in his head lay everything he needed to start over, everything he needed to build something that would turn these walls, these castles, and these knights in shining armor into useless junk. The king had banished him to a place of manure and ashes, with willows along the river and an old blacksmith's shop, to a place where everything exists. On 2nd week, Aidan stopped sleep. It's not because I didn't want to, it's that I could stop. The saltpeter was in 3 clay bowls under straw, white, clean. He dug it every night. He scratched the walls of the barns. He dug under the old livestock yard where the ground was soaked with urine and manure for decades. I dissolved it, boiled, filtered, cooled. By end the 2nd week, he had almost 2 pounds of pure crystals. That will be for a handful of gunpowder. But gunpowder is not just saltpeter. You need coal. You need sulfur. With coal, it was simple. Willows grew along the river. Aidan chopped down several thick branches. He chopped into pieces. I stacked in a pot and coated clay, leaving a small opening at the top. I placed it to the blacksmith's when he went to have lunch. The fire was burning without Axe's air. From the opening, a smoke. Through 3 hours, Aidan took out a pot and smashed it. Inside lay a black, fragile piece of coal. Light. Porous. Willow charcoal burns cleaner and faster than oak. It is to the best grades gunpowder. This, Aiden knew that. Where did he that? Exactly, he preferred not think about it. With Gray it was more difficult. In Turnovo, broad Gray at here. The nearest spring is Southern Fairs, but before them, 3 days to go. It Aiden's had a horse, nor money, nor right to leave the village. He could have asked someone of the peasants, but for reason. He has nothing pay with. On the day in the village, a merchant, an old man on a creaking cart with bags of salt and bundles of fish. He used to come once a month. He exchanged the merchandise for hides and honey. Aiden approached to him and asked if Ainan's sulfur. The merchant looked at him with suspicion. He asked why the alchemist sulfur in such hole. Aiden replied that he wants to make an ointment for scabies for village livestock. The merchant snorted. Gray at him didn't. But he knew a man at fair in Medno Colm, which sells all sorts of pharmacy junk. If the alchemist gives him anything in, the merchant will bring sulfur to next visit in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Aiden clenched his teeth. But choice was. He returned to barn and began thinking how to pay. He didn't had anything, only hands and head. On the next morning, he arrived to village head and proposed a deal. He will cure the lame mare of the village headman. He has an abscess on back leg which local quack doctor could not cure. Aiden saw this wound and knew that it's necessary. Rinsing with boiled water, a poultice made from willow bark, bandage with clean cloth every day. Simple things, but in the village where wounds are treated with manure and spells, it looked like a miracle. The village head agreed. If the mare stands up on her, then the merchant will be paid from the village's supplies. Aiden was treating the mare for 6 days. He washed the wound. He changed the compresses. On the 7th day, the horse stopped limp. The village head watched at it in silence, then took off his hat. He didn't, by a miracle. In the face of the result, Aiden earned his first trust. Not words, with my hands. Until he waited the sulfur something, Taya began come to his barn every evening. At first, in silence. She stood behind the door and watched as he stirred coal into mortar. Then I began ask questions. Why coal from willow and not from oak? Why are white if the earth is made which they was taken is brown? Why did the water after boiling becomes clear? Aiden replied, in short and to the point, without leniency, as to a colleague. And I remarked that the girl remembers everything from the very time. He named the number. How many parts of in 1 part of coal? Taya repeated the next day without a hitch. He named the temperature at which the solution needed to be removed from the heat. Taya memorized that one too. She had a memory for numbers that Aiden hadn't even seen in the college's masters. He needed an assistant, sooner or later. One person can't do everything. But taking on a 12-year-old girl as an apprentice in the art of gunpowder isn't a decision you make lightly. He hadn't made it yet. He was just letting her watch. Toward the end of the 2nd week, a boy came to the shed. Tane, 15 years old, the son of a fisherman who had drowned the previous spring. Broad-shouldered for his age, quiet. Taya had brought him. She said that Tane was strong and could carry heavy loads. Aiden looked at the boy. He stood there, crumpling his cap in his hands. Aiden asked if he knew how to keep what he saw to himself. Tane nodded. Aiden asked if he could count to 100. Tane shook his head. Aiden sighed. He said he'd teach him. By the 3rd week, the merchant had brought sulfur, a small sack, yellow lumps with a pungent odor. Aiden weighed it on his homemade scales. 1.5 pounds. Not much, but enough for the first test. Now he had everything: saltpeter, coal, sulfur. He knew the proportions: 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts coal, 10 parts sulfur. The classic formula. But simply mixing the powders wasn't enough. A dry mixture clumps together. It burns unevenly. It explodes unpredictably. It needs to be granulated. Wet mixing. Add water until it reaches the consistency of thick dough. Mix until completely homogeneous. Press through a sieve. Dry it. Every granule the same size. Every granule burns the same. Aiden worked through the night by the light of a torch. Tane held the mortar. Taya didn't sleep. She sat in the corner and watched. Aiden forbade her from coming closer than 3 steps. She didn't argue. He mixed the ingredients in a wooden mortar, slowly, carefully. He added water, stirred. The mixture began to resemble wet clay, dark gray, heavy. He pressed it through a piece of canvas with tiny holes. Small lumps fell onto the fabric. He spread them out on a board. He left them to dry. By morning, the grains had hardened, dark gray, shiny, all the same size. Aiden picked up a single grain and placed it on a stone. He held a splinter of wood to it. The grain ignited instantly. A bright white flash, a sharp crack, a small cloud of smoke. Tane jumped back. Taya didn't flinch, only her eyes widened. Aiden looked at the scorch marks on the stone. Clean, almost no soot. Complete combustion. It was the right kind of gunpowder. Now he needed to test it in action. There was an arquebus in the village, an old matchlock. It hung on the village headman's wall. It hadn't fired properly in about 5 years. Aiden asked to take a look at it. The headman brought it over. The barrel was dirty, the lock was loose, the front sight was knocked out of alignment. Aiden took the arquebus apart in the shed. He cleaned the barrel with a rod wrapped in a rag. He greased the lock with lard. He straightened the front sight. He put it back in place. He checked the priming hole. It was clogged. He cleared it out with a thin wire. He put it back together. The arquebus was old and crude. The barrel was uneven, the caliber was imprecise, but it would do for a test. He cast a lead bullet. He asked the blacksmith for a piece of lead and a mold. Orden gave it to him without asking. Aiden melted the lead in a spoon over a torch. He poured it into a clay mold he'd fashioned himself. The bullet turned out rough, but round and heavy. He measured out the charge, exactly 1 measure. He made the measure from a scrap of horn. He carved it out with a knife. He calibrated it by the weight of saltpeter. Every charge was identical. Every shot was predictable. That's what distinguishes a weapon from a toy. On the 5th day of the 3rd week, Aiden carried the arquebus out into the yard. The village elder was standing by the fence. Orden came out of the smithy. Tane was holding a plank, an oak one, 2 fingers thick. They nailed it to the wall of the shed at the far end of the yard. 120 paces. For an old arquebus with old gunpowder, that's an unattainable distance. 50 paces is the limit. Aiden rested the barrel on the fence. He poured in the charge. He rammed the bullet in with the ramrod. He lit the fuse. He pressed the butt against his shoulder. He took aim. The shot rang out so loudly that the village headman's hat flew off in surprise. Not from the wind, from the sound. The roar was 3 times louder than usual. White smoke, a sharp smell. The bullet went right through the oak plank and into the barn wall. Tane ran up to the plank. There was a hole in it the size of a finger. Clean, even, from 120 paces away. The The village headman stood there without his hat, staring at the hole in the plank, then at Aidan, then back at the hole. Orden crossed himself, slowly, with difficulty, as if his hand wouldn't obey him. Tain looked at Aidan as if he'd seen a saint. Taya stood around the corner of the house. She saw everything, and she didn't cross herself. She was counting.
120 paces, 2 oak fingers, 1 measure of gunpowder. She was memorizing it. Aidan blew out the barrel. His hands trembled slightly, not from the recoil, from the realization of what he had just done. In this world, there was no gunpowder capable of piercing an oak plank from such a distance. Royal gunpowder was good for ceremonial salutes. The church made sure nothing more powerful ever appeared. And he had just made something out of manure and ash that was more powerful than any mage. The village elder approached. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that the empty smithy annex could be given to the alchemist if he made more gunpowder, because the wolves had become completely brazen this winter, and so had the bandits on the western road. Aidan nodded. He was given the smithy. The blacksmith's annex became his laboratory, a small and cramped, but with a roof that didn't leak and a mountain which provided heat. Aidan was the first thing cleaned the room. He hauled out the trash, sealed the cracks with clay, knocked together a table from planks, set up at my homemade scales, 2 pottery shards on a string across a stick. Rough, but it works. Accuracy up to a 1/4 spool. For start will do. The next 2 weeks he was building a saltpeter works, not in workshop, in the village, at the old barn which had no longer in use. The principle is simple. A long pit in ground, layers of manure and ash and straw. On top, a cover to rain. Urine for to is added once a week. After half a year in this pit, so much of that there will be for dozens, pounds of gunpowder. But half a year is a long time. Until the hole is maturing, Aidan continued, scratch the walls of the barns and livestock yards. White coating, slightly salty crystals. Every handful counted. Count. Tain helped out. The guy turned out to be diligent, not fast in his thoughts, but reliable in hands. He carried water to boiling, he chopped firewood for the furnace, ground coal in a mortar for hours without complaining. Aidan taught him to count. He started with the basics, 10 plus 10, how measures in pound, how many grains of gunpowder in one charge. Tain frowned his and moved his lips, but he remembered. Taya was learning faster. She already knew all the proportions by heart. 75, 15, 10. She knew exactly what temperature to remove the count of from the heat. She knew how much water to add when grinding. She knew that willow charcoal is better than oak, and why. Aidan caught in thinking that was talking with her as an equal. She asked questions about which the men didn't come up with. Once I asked why grain gunpowder burns faster than powder if it coarser. Aidan stopped. That was the right question. Very right. He explained. The grain is porous. Inside it is air. Fire penetrates immediately through all sides. The powder clumps into a dense mass. The fire creeps across surface slowly. Taya nodded. I'll remember. She went to wash the bowls. She was 12 years, and she knew gunpowder better than most cannoneers of the army. This scarecrow. And it gave hope. On the 6th week, true winter, snow fell just one night. Thick, wet, heavy. The village lay still. The roads became impassable. The merchant could noble come until spring. Aidan knew that this meant 3 months of isolation, no supplies, no sulfur from the south. Only that is. He counted the supplies. 12 pounds of saltpeter, 4 pounds willow charcoal, 1.5 pounds of sulfur.
This will be for 15 pounds of gunpowder. 15 pounds is roughly 200 shots from an arquebus, or 50 rounds for something bigger, if he'd been careful with them. But he wasn't. In the second week of winter, the wolves came. Not one or two, a pack, 9 of them. They killed 2 sheep on the first night. On the second night, they dragged a goat right out of the pen. The village elder gathered the villagers. There were 2 hunters in Ternøvibrod, both with bows. Bows against a pack of wolves are no laughing matter, especially at night, especially in winter. Aiden proposed his plan. 3 nights, 3 ambushes, an arquebus with its gunpowder. He set out the bait, the remains of sheep carcasses, arranged in a semicircle outside the village. He himself sat behind a wattle fence 40 paces away with his arquebus and 6 prepared rounds. It was a moonlit night, cold, the snow glistened. The wolves came around midnight, 5 of them, cautious. They approached the bait slowly, sniffing the air. Aiden waited. His hands were freezing on the barrel. His breath came out in steam. He let them get within 30 paces. The first shot. The roar echoed over the sleeping village. The leader collapsed on the spot. The bullet hit him in the side. The others scattered, but one froze for a second, stunned by the sound. Aiden reloaded. His hands moved quickly. Ramrod, gunpowder, bullet, fuse, second shot. The second wolf fell. The rest fled into the forest. They never returned. 2 wolves in 2 minutes. From 30 paces away, in the dark. The village elder stood in his underwear on the threshold of his house, staring at the 2 dark bodies in the snow. The village didn't lose a single sheep that winter. Aiden skinned them. He gave the hides to Tay's widow. The meat was divided among everyone. He didn't take a share for himself. He said he had enough bread. That wasn't true. He didn't have enough. But the village was starving, and an extra mouth that also took a share from the communal pot wouldn't last long. Not physically, socially. Winter dragged on. Aiden worked. During the day, he helped the village. He repaired tools. He treated frostbitten hands and feet with poultices made from willow bark. He made an ointment for the village elder's aching joints. At night, he worked for himself. He ground, he mixed, he dried. He wrote things down. He kept his records on birch bark. There was no ink. He made it himself. Soot, water, and a drop of resin. Rough ink, but legible. He wrote everything down, every experiment, every result, every failure. In the middle of winter, something happened that changed everything. The wife of the blacksmith Orden gave birth. The labor was difficult. The baby was in the wrong position. The local midwife managed to deliver the baby, but on the 3rd day, the mother developed a fever. Her face was flushed. The wound had become infected. Her fever rose with every passing hour. The midwife shook her head. She said it was in the hands of the flame. Orden stood in the courtyard, pale as a sheet. Aiden arrived uninvited. He looked at the patient. Red streaks ran from the wound up her abdomen. Fever, rapid breathing, childbed fever, infection. In his world, thousands had died from this until they understood one simple thing: cleanliness. You have to wash your hands. You have to boil your instruments. You have to clean the wound, not with manure, not with prayer, but with boiled water and something that kills the infection. He didn't know about antibiotics. They couldn't be made here. But he knew something else. Willow bark reduces fever. Alcohol kills germs in a wound. He didn't have any alcohol. But the village elder had a barrel of mash. Aiden asked Iris for some. No, Iris hadn't come yet. He asked the village elder. The elder gave it to him without question. Aiden distilled the mash, a simple still made from a cauldron and a copper tube he'd begged from Orden. The vapor travels through the tube. The tube runs through a bucket of cold water. A liquid drips from the outlet. Clear, strong. It smells like alcohol. He distilled it twice. He ended up with something close to 70 degrees. That was enough. He and the midwife washed the wound, every 2 hours, day and night. Aiden hadn't slept for 2 days. He changed the willow bark poultices on her forehead. He gave the patient the decoction to drink. He made her drink water, lots of water. By the morning of the 3rd day, the fever began to subside. By evening, the woman opened her eyes. She asked for something to eat. Orden stood in the doorway, unable to speak. In the morning, he went out into the yard where Aiden was sitting on a log, trying not to fall asleep. The blacksmith knelt down in front of him. He just knelt there, silently. A huge, silent man on his knees in the snow before a thin alchemist with burned hands. Aiden was taken aback. He knelt down beside him. He put his arms around the blacksmith's shoulders. They sat like that in the snow for a minute or two. They didn't say a word. Taya watched through the window of the widow's house. She saw her master kneeling in the snow, hugging the blacksmith, and she understood everything she needed to know about this man. He wasn't a saint, not a mage, not a hero from fairy tales. He was simply a man who couldn't walk away, who couldn't help but do what he knew how to do, who healed because he knew how, who shot because he knew how, who calculated because he knew how. And he didn't ask for anything in return. From that day on, Orden became a different man. Not just a blacksmith who puts up with a strange lodger. He became an ally. When Aiden asked him to cast a mold for bullets, he didn't ask why. When Aiden asked him to forge a long rod for cleaning gun barrels, he had it done in a day. When Aiden said he'd need help in the spring with casting something large, Orden just nodded. Winter was well past its midpoint. Aiden was taking stock of his supplies. He had enough gunpowder left for 120 shots. The saltpeter works, buried under the snow, wasn't operating. There was just a trace of sulfur left at the bottom of the jar. But spring was near, and with spring would come the roads, and merchants, and opportunities, and dangers. Spring arrived to Thornford with mud and hope. The snow was melting, the roads were turning into rivers. But together with meltwater came people. First to arrive, Iris Morrow. She appeared on bridge at late March, thin, tattered, with sunken eyes. She walked through the forest 6 months. It spent the winter in an abandoned coal mine. She ate roots and something whatever I could to steal from fields up to the snow. The church announced her a witch a year ago. For that I the peasants with decoctions instead of prayers. The monastery from where she fled burned down in a week after her escape. The Inquisitors. To smoke out those who had hidden it. Taya saw her first. She ran toward Aiden. I told that on bridge there's woman and what she is managing on her feet. Aiden went out. He looked at Iris, at her hands. They were covered burns. No from the fire, from plants. Burns from hogweed, blisters from a mortar, dark spots from black walnut. These were hands healers. He said to that it is safe. Iris looked at him with eyes. She asked if... Aiden didn't answer. Instead that he led her to the workshop. I sat by the bell. He gave some water, bread, a piece of dried meat. Iris ate in silence. Her hands were so badly that she twice dropped the mug. She didn't really for real until the 3rd day. I just slept. I ate. Slept. On 3rd day she went out into the yard. She saw willow bark which Aiden was drying on a clothesline. She stopped. I touched with my fingers. I looked at him. She asked, what? Aiden replied that for poultices. Iris shook her head. She said that he was incorrectly. The bark should be removed in the spring, when it's sap, then in it more than relieves fever. And this bark, winter bark, in it half of its strength. Aiden looked at her with curiosity. She knew about properties willow bark that he vaguely. She knew that not from someone else's memory, but from one's own hands, from years with herbs. He asked what she could do. Iris began to list them: decoctions, infusions, poultices, ointments. She knew 200 with more plants and their properties. She knew when to pick them, how to dry them, how to store them, how to mix to one enhances the other. Aiden listened and felt as in my head a new picture. He needed was exactly that. Not student, a partner, a person who knows the practice, there where he knows the theory. He suggested her work together. Iris remained silent. Then she asked if. She is by the church's church. All who it helped were on fire. Aiden replied that he, heretic according to the verdict by the crown. And so in this village they both were, simply people who know, do useful things. Iris, for the first time in 3 days, smiled. It was subtly, just the corners of her lips. She remained. The next weeks they worked side. Iris found herself not just a mere herb. She understood processes. She didn't call them scientific terms, but saw the essence. When Aiden explained her the principle of recrystallization, she nodded and said that she was that, exactly. With salt for her ointments, just didn't know that this is that. When he showed her the process granulation of gunpowder, she watched in silence for 5 minutes. Then she said she saw 3 areas where improvements could be made: the size of the sieve's mesh, the amount of water, and the drying time. Aiden checked. She was right on all 3 points. He began writing her name next to his in his birch bark notes. Iris saw this by chance. She stopped. She stared for a long time at the 2 names side by side. She didn't say anything, but from that day on, she began to work even harder. In April, a second problem arose: bandits. A gang was operating on the western road between Turnoff Brod and the nearest town, Mednikholm. A dozen former soldiers, deserters or those discharged due to injury. They robbed merchants and peasants. They took food and money. Sometimes they killed. The road was the village's only link to the outside world. Without it, there would be no sulfur, no lead, no iron. The village head said grimly that it wasn't their business. The village was small. It would be foolish to confront a dozen armed men. Better to wait it out. Aiden didn't argue, but he began to prepare. He made 3 more rounds for the arquebus. He cast bullets. He taught Tane how to load it, not how to shoot, just how to load, quickly and correctly. Ramrod, gunpowder, bullet. Tamp it down. Check the fuse. Tane repeated the sequence until he could do it in 30 seconds. Iris watched these preparations with anxiety. She asked Aiden if he was planning to fight the bandits all by himself. Aiden shook his head. He said he hoped he wouldn't have to. But he did. At the end of April, 4 members of the gang came to the village. They just showed up, in broad daylight, with swords at their belts. Their leader was a burly man with a jagged scar running across his cheek. He told the village headman that the village would now pay tribute, a sack of grain a month, and a barrel of beer if they had any. The village headman turned pale. A sack of grain a month meant starvation for 17 people. Aiden stood at the workshop door. He listened. He counted. 4 of them. Swords. No armor. 30 paces away. He didn't go out. He didn't intervene. Not yet. The bandits left. They gave them a week to deliver the first sack. The village head gathered the villagers that evening. They talked for a long time. There were two options: pay and starve, or flee. Nowhere to run. Aiden raised his hand. He said there was a third option. He laid out the plan.
The village head listened with the expression of someone who wanted to object, but couldn't think of a reason why. Orden listened in silence. Then he nodded. 3 days later, the bandits came for the tribute, all 10 of them, confident and brazen. A village of just 4 homesteads. What could possibly go wrong? They entered across the bridge, single file. The bridge was narrow. 2 couldn't pass at once. Aiden waited behind the wattle fence of the first homestead, holding an arquebus. Tane stood nearby with spare rounds. Orden was around the corner of the smithy, holding a hammer. 2 hunters on the rooftops with bows. The first shot. The scarred leader fell on the bridge, a bullet to the chest, from 20 paces away. The second collapsed from an arrow in the shoulder. The rest didn't realize what was happening. The roar of an arquebus in the confined space between the houses was like a clap of thunder. They froze for half a second. That was enough. Aiden reloaded. Tane handed him the supplies, just like in training. Gunpowder, bullet, ramrod, fuse. 25 seconds. Second shot. Another one fell. The rest ran. Some back across the bridge, some off to the side. 2 ran into Orden around the corner of the blacksmith shop. A blacksmith's hammer in the hands of a man weighing 120 pounds is a terrifying thing. One of the hunters hit a fleeing man in the leg with an arrow. 5 minutes later, it was all over. 4 dead, 2 wounded. The rest had fled. The village hadn't suffered a scratch. Aiden sat behind the fence and looked at the bodies. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, and from realization. He had just killed 2 people, for the first time in his life. He knew it was necessary. He knew the alternative was worse, but that knowledge didn't help. Iris walked over to him. She sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Her hand lay next to his on the wet ground, not touching, but close. Taya came out of the house where she'd been hiding with her mother and younger siblings. She looked at the bodies. She didn't look away. She looked at the master. He sat there, pale, his hands trembling, staring at the ground. She realized he was in pain. She brought him water, the same mug she'd used to give him a drink on the first day. Aiden drank it. He thanked her. He looked at Taya. She had grown over those months, not in body, but in her eyes. That evening, they buried the bandits, outside the village, without a cross. Iris bandaged the wounded. 1 died by nightfall. The other was nursed back to health and released a week later. Aiden told him that if anyone from the gang returned, next time there would be 10 barrels, not just 1. The wounded man hobbled away down the road, glancing back every 10 steps. The bandits never came back. Word spread throughout the region. In Ternovi Broad lives an alchemist whose arquebus fires like a cannon. Better to give him a wide berth. Aiden didn't know that this rumor would reach the capital in 6 months. But that didn't matter now. Something else was important now. The village was safe. He had a workshop. He had assistants. He had Iris with her herbs and her wit. He had Orden with his hammer and his hands. He had Taya and Tane. He had gunpowder. Now he had to think about the next step, about something bigger, about something he couldn't do alone. He needed people, real people, soldiers, officers, those who know how to fight, because wolves and bandits are small fry. Sooner or later,
real enemies would come for him.
Cale Morn arrived to Thornford at the beginning summer. From him had 6 people, all the former soldiers of the guards, all in tattered uniforms without distinguishing of rank, all with swords that have seen best days. Cale was tall, lean, with dark under his eyes and the movements of a person who long hadn't sleep peacefully. He was 30 years, and he looked like 40. His younger brother was executed 4 months ago, based on a false accusation, the charge of treason. The trial lasted half a day. The verdict was won. Cale stood in formation when his brother's, fell into basket. He was standing by at a detention and watched. That's was ordered. That, he gathered 6 men. Those who knew that the denunciation was false. Those who saw who wrote it. They left from barracks through the back gate. Desertion. Also, 1 execution if caught. 2 months they walked toward north, through the forests, along country roads. I'm food. We avoided patrols. We heard various rumors. One rumor stuck with me. In village Ternovi Broad lives an alchemist who was banished by the king. He gunpowder that strikes like magic. Cale didn't believe in magic dust,
but he believed in people whom he had that same king who killed his brother. Of my enemy. He came and asked to come in. He stood in front of Aiden in the yard of the workshop, straight, with stone face. He said, someone, where from, why he was running, what that his people know keep formation and sharpen there and stand on guard. He said that they need a roof and a purpose. Aiden listened in silence. He looked at Kayla, then at his people, 6 behind the lieutenant, exhausted, hungry, but they stand straight, out of habit, guards training. He asked Cale why he wanted it really. Cale replied without hesitation. He wants for the person who thee against his brother replied for it. Aiden nodded. He said that he understood. But revenge is not a plan. Revenge is a desire. A plan he will later. For now, let his people eat and rest. Cale watched at him for a long time, appraisingly. Then he nodded. Something in Aiden's caught him. It wasn't words. Calm. A man who was banished. The king said as follows, as if knew something that didn't know the rest of us. It was as if he had a trump card in which everyone find out when he decides to reveal it. The first week, Cale and his people simply lived. They ate, they slept, they came to their senses. Aiden fed them from a shared cauldron. The village took in them with suspicion. 7 armed men, this not joke, for 4 courtyards. But Cale knew how to carry himself. His people didn't make a sound. They get cocky. They helped with the work. We chopped firewood. They were a bridge. We built a new pen for cattle. After week, Aiden called Cale to the workshop. He closed the door. He showed him the gunpowder. I explained how it works. Why is it more than the usual one? Cale was listening without expression on his face. Then Aiden brought him out to village. He set a target, and board, with 50 steps, further than in last time. He improved the gunpowder with those time. Iris helped with the quality of the coal. It fired. The board shattered. Cale stood and stared at the splinters. His did not change, but his clenched into fists. He turned toward Aiden. He asked quietly, how many guns he can make. Aiden replied that for now, 1. But if there is help and time and resources, that by fall there may be 20. Cale asked what he needed. Aiden began to list them. Security, that's that soon they'll will those who don't should see. Patrols, That's that strangers' eyes on the road is death. Discipline. That's that one careless word at fair and a month here-there. Inquisitor Kale listened and nodded. That was his language. Perimeter, guard, discretion. He understood every word. After 2 days, 6 former guardsmen stood up at their posts. 2 men on bridge, 2 on the western road, 2 on the eastern path through the forest. Shifts by 6 hours. Report personally, Kalu. The village, for the first time in its history, had security. Aiden used the opportunity, time, and safety to speed up work. It expanded the workshop. He added a shed for drying gunpowder. It deepened the saltpeter works, launched a second pit, began hoard sulfur. The merchant brought it in small portions. It's expensive, but Hana Cho isn't appeared and other suppliers there yet. Iris worked on the cord. Aiden explained her the idea. The rope soaked a compound that burns with a known speed. It does not fast and not slowly, just right, predictably, so that it to measure the length and know how seconds until the fire. Iris listened. Then she flent into forest. She came back after 3 days with a bag some stems. She said that this the pith of a certain reed. It dry, porous, absorbs the solution evenly. If soaked with in the desired concentration, then it burn evenly. They tried it. The first attempt, the line flared up in bursts. It flared up and fade. The concentration of the solution was low. Second attempt, it burned too fast. It was burning in seconds. The concentration was high. Third attempt, Iris changed plant. She picked a different variety of reed, with more dense pith, soaked it, set it on fire. The wick burned steady, slowly, red smoldering flame. Aiden noticed the time. The elbow of the cord was 40 seconds, consistently, give or take 2 seconds. That was a cord, rough, imperfect, but it works. Aiden looked at Iris. She was standing and looked at the flickering little with an expression that he saw on himself in the mirror. The joy of discovery, pure, without impurity. He said her that she a genius. Iris shook her head. She said that she just knows plants. Aiden wrote in a birch bark journal, Bickford's Fuse. Option 3. Author Iris Morrow and Aiden Crow. Iris saw it later. Her name. First. Before his first name. She did. But her hands, for, a stopped move. In the middle summer, Aiden began think about the cannon. An arquebus is good. But one arquebus is 1 barrel. 1 shot for 30 seconds. Against the blem of this is not enough. He needs something stronger. Something that will stop the cavalry. Something that break through the wall. He knew how to do it, in theory. A bronze barrel. Core casting. Uniform wall thickness. Trunnions for the carriage. But casting requires bronze. A lot of bronze. There was no bronze in the village smithy. The nearest source was the town of Copper Hill. There were foundries there. People who knew how to smelt copper and tin worked there. But Copper Hill was a day's journey away, and there were eyes and ears there. Aiden thought about it for 3 days. Then he spoke with Kale. They needed an ally in the town, someone they could trust, someone who could connect the village to resources they didn't have here. Kale said there was one among his men, Private Fenn. Before joining the army, he'd worked as an apprentice to a foundryman in Medney Colm. His master, an old man named Gareth, still runs the workshop, and he still hates the crown because his eldest son was taken into the army and never returned. Aiden sent Fenn to Copper Hill with a letter for Gareth. There was nothing dangerous in the letter, just an order. A bronze casting of a specific shape, a cylinder with bulges, with no explanation of what it was for. Fenn left in the morning. He returned 4 days later with a reply. Gareth agreed. The price was high, but he agreed. He didn't ask why. Foundrymen don't ask questions when they're paid in silver, and Aiden had silver. a little. The village elder had paid him for treating the blacksmith's mare and wife. Orden chipped in some of his own. Cale gave the last of what he had left. That was enough for the first order. While the bronze cylinder was being cast in Copper Hill, Aidan prepared everything else. A gun carriage, a simple wooden frame on 2 wheels. Orden forged the axles. Cale and the soldiers cut down and hewn oak beams. The wheels were taken from a wrecked wagon, rough but functional. A priming hole, a fuse, a cleaning rod, a loading scoop. Aidan made all of this himself, from wood, from bone, from scraps of iron, each tool from memory, from the knowledge that came to him that night in the wagon. 2 weeks later, Fenn brought the barrel, a bronze cylinder, heavy, smooth on the inside, with 2 trunnions on the sides, small, a half-pound cannon, about 2 inches in caliber. Thick walls, maybe too thick, but better too thick than too thin. Aidan examined the barrel, tapped it, listened to the sound, checked the inner surface for pitting and cracks. Found 1 small one, not critical. He mounted the barrel on the carriage, secured the trunnions, checked the elevation angles. Everything lined up, on paper. Now it had to be tested in practice. On the morning of the 5th day of the 8th month of exile, Aidan rolled the cannon out beyond the village. Cale set up a cordon. No one but their own people was to see it. Tain brought the gunpowder, 3 pounds, a charge for the first test shot, half a charge, for safety's sake. Iris stood to the side, far away. She was afraid of fire. She always had been, ever since the monastery burned behind her. But she had come, because this was important. Taya stood next to Iris. She counted to herself. The charge, the distance to the target, the barrel angle. The target. The boulder. A large granite boulder at the edge of the field. It had stood there since time immemorial, 100 paces from the cannon. Aidan packed the charge, tamped down the wadding, loaded the stone projectile. Round. Shaped by Orden on an anvil. Rough, but round. He inserted the fuse, measured it out. 10 seconds of burn time. He lit it. He stepped back 5 paces. He counted to himself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The shot. The sound wasn't like that of an arquebus. It was a blow, a physical one. The ground shook beneath his feet. Smoke engulfed everything, thick, white, suffocating smoke. When the smoke cleared, Aidan saw the boulder, or rather, what was left of it. The stone had split into 3 pieces. The fragments were scattered 10 paces in every direction. In the center was a depression, as if a giant had struck the stone with his fist. Cale stood motionless. So did his soldiers. One of them dropped to one knee, not out of fear, out of understanding. He was a soldier. He had fought. He knew what it meant for a stone to be split in 2 by a single blow from 100 paces away. It meant that fortress walls were no longer worth anything. It meant that knightly cavalry was no longer worth anything. It meant that the world had just changed. Orden stood by the gun carriage. He touched the hot barrel. His eyes were wet, not from the smoke. He saw the future. His future. A future in which a blacksmith was no longer a lowly man. A future in which his hands were more important than a knight's sword. Aidan approached the cannon. He examined the barrel. No cracks, no warping. It had held up. He stroked the bronze. Warm. Alive. His first cannon. Small. Rough. But it worked. Taya approached him. She asked quietly, "What's next?" Aidan looked at her, at Iris, at Cale, at Orden, at the 6 soldiers, at the village behind them. He replied, "Next, we need 10 more like this. Then 20. Then we need to find people to fire them. and people to cast them, and people to haul the gunpowder and cannonballs, and a place where we can do all this without hiding. Cale asked, "When?" Aiden replied, "By winter, 1 year since our exile." He looked south, toward where, beyond the forests and hills, stood the capital, where King Anselm sat on his throne, thinking his former alchemist had died in the swamps. Aiden didn't smile. He just stood there and looked. The next blueprint was already taking shape in his mind. Not cannons, places, a foundry. Aiden found a place in a week after the test cannon. Cale sent 2 soldiers on reconnaissance upriver. They returned through 3 days and reported. On 20 versts to the northeast stands an abandoned mining settlement. The mine has been 1515 ago. People have left. All that's left, stone walls, the meaning with large forge, 3 barracks, a warehouse, and most importantly, the river with a fast current. The river is energy. Water wheel, mill, a hammer. Everything that you to stop do dust in the mortar with my hands. Aiden went to take a look for himself. He took Kayla and Orden. We went 2 days through the forest. The village was a narrow valley between 2 hills, the approach only from one side. On the road which overgrown so that without a guide you find it. Perfect. The walls are made of stone, thick. They were built for miners who worked all year. The roofs collapsed, but the walls are still standing. But is huge by compared to a village one. 2 anvil. An anvil has become into ground. The bellows have rotted, but the frame is intact. The river flowed toward 30 steps from the smithy. Fast. Cold. Elevation in at elbow to short stretch. That is for the wheel. Aiden went through the Thames and counted. He counted everything. The length of the walls, the width of the gate, distance from the forge to the river, the depth of the old tunnels, the volume of storage. He didn't know ruins. He saw a drawing. Here the foundry yard. Here is the mill. Here is the drying room. Here is the lay of finished charges. Here are the barracks. Here is the infirmary. Iris will assign him at the eastern wall where the morning sun. Here is a school. Yes, a school. That's that an illiterate artilleryman is dead. Artilleryman. Cale looked at all this with the perspective of a Tath who is used to evaluate positions. He saw something else. The hills, with both sides, are natural walls. A narrow approach is the neck of the bottle. 10 shooters on the hills will hold 100, and if on the hills there are cannons, then 8 and 1,000. Orden began to keep the walls of the smithy. He stroked the stone. His eyes were ablaze. Large horns. A large anvil. A place for real work. Not just patch and repair, but real casting. They returned to Ternovi Brod, and Aiden gathered everyone. The village elder, Kayla, Iris, Orden, Teu, and Tana. Explained the plan. They are moving. Not everyone. The village remains a village, but the workshop and everything that with it is into the settlement, which with that day is called Litany Yard. The village head asked who would to defend the village. Aiden replied that 2 soldiers Kayla would remain in Ternovo Brod, with an arquebus and a supply gunpowder. That will be enough to wolves and bandits. A serious enemy will come not to the village. A serious enemy will come there where smoke from the chimney. The move took a month, a tough month. We hauled in there and on the only cart. Gunpowder, tools, supplies of saltpeter, sulfur, lead, bronze barrel of a cannon. The carriage was taken apart and reassembled again in the spot. Orden moved his anvil. 200 pounds of iron on a cart through a forest road. The wheel broke twice. Cale swore. Orden remained silent and fixed things. First thing, Aiden set up a water wheel. Simple, wooden.
Oak blades on oak shaft. The shaft rotates the axle. The axle can be connected to whatever, to thumb for grinding coal, to thumb for the forge, to the hammer for forging. One wheel is 10 pairs hands that don't get tired. The wheel started on the third day, with a creak, with splashes, crooked, but it worked. Tane stood and watched at the spinning blades with open mouth, for it was magic. For Aiden, it was the beginning. Iris took the eastern barracks. She set up an infirmary and a laboratory. She laid out her herbs. She hung up bundles of dried plants. She set up the still for making alcohol. The barracks smelled of mint and wormwood and something bitter that Aiden couldn't identify. Iris said it was the root of a plant that had no name in the common tongue. The southern nuns called it by a word that translates roughly as the one that drives away rot. She used it to treat wounds. It worked better than alcohol. Aiden asked her to show him. Iris showed him. He watched the process and learned. Not exactly. Roughly. In the foreign memory that lived in his head, there was something similar. Phenolic compounds. The antiseptic properties of plant extracts. He didn't remember the details, but he saw the general idea. Iris had found a natural antiseptic without even knowing the word antiseptic, using her hands and her experience. He wrote her name down first in the journal again. The 9th month of exile had passed. 23 people lived in Latiny Dvor. 7 of Kale's soldiers, Orden with his wife and newborn son, Iris, Taya with her mother, Tane, 3 young men from Ternavoy Brod who wanted to study, 2 coal miners from the forest who had shown up on their own, and an old clerk named Derek. Derek deserved a separate mention. He had come alone, on foot, from the capital. A former scribe of the Royal College, the very institution where Aiden had once been a master. Derek was a quiet, balding man in his 50s, with perpetually frightened eyes and handwriting that made copyists weep, because his letters were perfect. Every single one. He was fired from the college a month after Aiden's exile, officially for wasting ink. In reality, because he refused to rewrite the title page of Aiden's treatise with the author's new name. He was ordered to put the king's name there. He refused. Quietly, polite, but he refused. He was thrown out without pay. He walked north for 4 months. Because he'd heard that Aiden was alive. When Derek told Aiden this, Aiden was silent for a long time. Then he hugged him. Derek burst into tears. Aiden gave him a position. Scribe of the Foundry Court, keeper of the records, literacy teacher. Because a school needed to be opened. Because people who couldn't read blueprints wouldn't be able to cast cannons. Derek taught. Tana, the coal miners, soldiers who knew the letters but wrote like a chicken scratch. He taught patiently, by syllables, by letters, on birch bark because there was no paper. Taya helped him. She could already read fluently. Aiden had taught her in the margins of the gunpowder logbook. Now she was teaching others. A 12-year-old girl was teaching 30-year-old soldiers how to put letters together to form words. And the soldiers listened, because she was the master's apprentice, and the master was respected here. By the 10th month, Aiden had cast his 2nd cannon, and his 3rd. Gareth of Copper Hill cast the barrels according to his blueprints. Fen hauled them by wagon at night, along forest roads, slowly, carefully. Each barrel cost so much that Aiden counted every coin. Money was scarce, catastrophically scarce. 23 men who needed to be fed, clothed, and supplied. 3 cannons that needed gunpowder and cannonballs. A dozen arquebuses that Aiden had assembled and refitted from old junk bought at fairs. Every arquebus required lead, gunpowder, and fuses. Everything costs money, which they didn't have. Kale suggested robbing the royal supply train on the southern road.
Aiden refused. He said they weren't bandits. Cale clenched his jaw. He said nothing. But in his eyes, Aiden saw what he was seeing more and more often: impatience. Cale wanted to act. He wanted to strike. He wanted revenge. Every day of waiting was torture for him. His brother was dead. The man who did this was alive and well, walking around the capital in an expensive cloak. And Cale was sitting in the woods, waiting for the alchemist to cast enough barrels. Aiden understood him, but he couldn't give him what he wanted. It wasn't time yet. Too soon. Not enough barrels. Not enough people. One mistake and everything would come crashing down. Everything he'd been building for 10 months. Everything those 23 people who'd trusted him had been building. He told Cale, "Be patient. Another half a year." Cale replied that in half a year, it might be too late. That rumors were spreading, that sooner or later, someone in the capital would hear about the strange smoke rising from the northern forests. Aiden knew Cale was right, but there was no alternative. Only to build, only to teach, only to wait. Fall gave way to winter, the second winter of exile. The foundry yard was buried in snow. The river froze over. The water wheel stopped. Work slowed down but didn't stop. Orden forged by the light of torches. Tane ground coal by hand. Derek taught literacy in the barracks by the hearth. Iris prepared medicine supplies. Taya kept track of everything. She kept track of everything all the time. Gunpowder supplies, lead supplies, food supplies. How many pounds of grain per day for 23 people? How many days until spring? How many days until famine? The numbers didn't add up. There wouldn't be enough food to last until March. She went to Aiden with these numbers. She placed the birch bark sheet on the table, silently. Aiden looked at it. He checked them. The numbers were accurate. She hadn't made a single mistake. There wouldn't be enough food for 6 weeks. He looked at Taya. She was 13. She had just calculated the food shortage for 23 people more accurately than the college treasurer would have. He told her. "Thank you." Taya nodded. She left. He remained sitting there, poring over the numbers, and thinking. As always, thinking. The food was brought. Selena Weir. She showed up at late January, on 2 sleds, with 3 servants, in fur over a travel dress, with bags of grain and salted meat and a small barrel butter, and with a face of a man who is used to the doors open when she to them approaches them. "Help!" On road stopped her half a verst from the courtyard. Cale came in person. He looked at her. On sleigh, at servants. He asked who and where they were from. Selena introduced herself. The daughter of Duke Vera. Cale knew that name. All of Valarin knew it. The Wayrov was the oldest after the royal family. Anselm destroyed it 3 years ago. The Duke was executed. His lands were confiscated. The family were scattered. Selena survived because they were sent to south to Prince Turan, where it immediately attempted to off to the son of the prince. Tolstoy is a capricious young man who collected hunting falcons and beat servants. Selena ran away after half a year. She took the rest of the family's gold that I had in lining of the trunk, and off she went to north. That's that I heard. Everyone heard it. In northern forests lives an alchemist who was banished by the king. He gunpowder that is more powerful magic. In he people who don't afraid the coronavirus. Cale brought her to Aiden. Aiden was sitting in a workshop working a drawing for a gun carriage. His hands in soot, hair unwashed been washed a week. The apron is scorched in 3 places. Selena looked at him, and her face showed exactly that as she was thinking. She expected to see, if not a commander, then at least someone impressive. and saw a thin man with burned hands and nearsighted eyes. She asked if it was the very Aiden Crow. Aiden nodded. He didn't stand up. He didn't bow. He wasn't to bow, and didn't was going to start. Selina sat across from him, without invitation. She put her hands on her table, her hands white, well-groomed, not a single burns, not a single blisters, the of a person whose spent life were cared for by others. She said that she had brought gold, 200 coins, and what she has connections, a little to know of the provinces, merchants from free cities, 3 barons who hate Anselm quietly and carefully. She can knit Aiden to them. It might open channels, supply channels. It can find people. In return, she wants one thing. She wants to get the name Weir, not land, not castle, a name. Aiden looked at her and thought. 200 gold coins is 10 cannons. That's half a year of food for 50 people. That's sulfur, lead, and copper for the entire coming year. Connections with the lower nobility mean information, eyes and ears all over Valarin. That's what he lacked most of all. Because an enemy you can't see is more dangerous than one you can. He agreed. Selina stayed, and the foundry court changed. Not right away. Gradually. Selina brought more than just gold with her. She brought order. A different kind of order. Not a military one like Kale's, a political one. She drew up lists. Who does what? Who reports to whom? Who is responsible for what? She set up an expense tracking system. Derek helped with the records, Taya with the calculations. The 3 of them created something in a week that hadn't existed before. A budget. A word that Aiden knew but the others didn't. Selina quickly realized that Aiden wasn't a fool. It took her longer to realize that he was more than just not a fool. She realized this when she came to the first test of the cannon. Aiden fired at a wooden shield from 200 paces away. The shield was blown to smithereens. Selina stood on the hill and watched. Her expression didn't change, but her arms, which she'd been holding crossed over her chest, unclenched and fell to her sides. She understood, not with her mind, with her body. What she had seen wasn't some village apothecary's trick. It was a weapon capable of breaking the backbone of any army in Valarin, including the royal army, including the army of the Otrand Empire gathering beyond the eastern mountains. She went to see Aiden that evening. She sat down across from him. She said she had underestimated him. She said it plainly, without apologies, as a statement of fact. Then she asked what his plan was. Not his immediate plan, his ultimate one. Aiden was silent for 10 seconds. Then he answered. He wants Valarin to cease being a kingdom where knowledge is considered heresy. He wants open schools, free workshops, the law against impure fire repealed. He wants a system in which no future Anselm could wipe out a person with a single decree. Selina listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said that to achieve this, they'd first have to overthrow Anselm. And for that, they'd need an army. And for an army, they'd need people. And people will follow whoever has a name. Aiden replied that he had no name. He had only gunpowder. Selina smiled, for the first time ever. She said that gunpowder was his new name, and that he simply hadn't realized it yet. February passed in work. Selina wrote letters, many letters, subtle ones, cautious ones, in a language Aiden didn't understand, a language of hints, nuances, and double meanings, the language of the nobility, who had learned to speak in such a way that even an intercepted letter could not be used as evidence. The letters were sent out by her servants. Replies arrived weeks later, always through different people, never directly. 3 barons confirmed their interest. Cautious, non-committal. But they confirmed it. One of them controlled a silver mine in the west. Another had connections with the merchant guilds of the free cities. The third commanded his district's militia. 300 men. Not soldiers, peasants with pitchforks. But 300 men are 300 men, if they were armed, if they were trained. By March, the foundry yard had grown to 35 people. They came one by one or in pairs. Artisans, peasants, runaway apprentices, one former monk who'd been defrocked for reading forbidden treatises. Aiden accepted them all. He found work for each one. He taught each one. He fed each one. Selina watched this and shook her head. She said he was too kind, that not everyone who came deserved to be trusted, that there might be a spy among them. Aiden replied that perhaps there was, but if he began to suspect every newcomer, it would no longer be a free district. It would be Anselm's little kingdom, only in the forest. Selina fell silent, not because she agreed, because she couldn't find an answer. Not yet, anyway. Meanwhile, Iris and Aiden were working on a new design, a fragmentation shell. The idea was simple. A hollow, cast-iron sphere, a charge of gunpowder inside. On the outside, an opening with a fuse. You light the fuse, you fire it from a cannon. The fuse burns as it flies. The shell falls, it explodes. Cast-iron shrapnel flies in all directions. Against infantry in formation, it's deadly. But making such a shell turned out to be incredibly difficult. The cast-iron sphere had to be smooth, with walls of uniform thickness, otherwise it would burst upon firing, or fail to burst upon impact, or split not into shrapnel, but into 2 halves. Orden tried. The first 3 spheres burst in the mold, the 4th came out warped. The 5th was smooth but too thick, the 6th was too thin. The 7th one worked. Thin, smooth, hollow, with a hole for the fuse. Aiden filled it with gunpowder, inserted the fuse, timed the burn. 12 seconds. They carried the projectile out beyond the foundry yard, placed it in a pit, lit the fuse, ran behind some rocks, counted. The explosion went off at the 11th second. Earth and rocks flew into the air. Shards of cast iron whistled over their heads. One lodged itself in a tree 20 paces away, deep, right through the very center. Cale pulled out the shard. He looked at the sharp, jagged edge. He turned it over in his fingers. He looked at Aiden. He said nothing. Words weren't necessary. They both knew what it meant. It meant that the next one to come and take the foundry yard wouldn't just get cannonballs. He'd get a rain of iron. And that next one was already close. Father Maurice arrived at early April, alone, on mule, on plain cassock without distinguishing of distinction, with leather bag in which were 3 books and a consecrated knife. The guard stopped him on the road. Cale arrived. He looked at Inquisitor. Her hand rested on sword. Maurice raised his palms. He pointed that was unarmed. The knife in bag wasn't Count's count. He said that he had come to talk. Just to talk. Cale didn't believe the Inquisitors. No one in Latany Courtyard did believe the Inquisitors. Iris at the word Inquisitor turned pale, and she left into her barracks. She closed the door. She didn't until evening. But Aiden said to let him in. Maurice entered into Foundry Courtyard and slowly looked around. His eyes took in everything. The blacksmith shop, cannons under the shed-covered canvas, barrels filled gunpowder, people who were stopped the work and watched at him. He didn't any fear nor surprise. The Inquisitors are taught to control their facial expressions. Aiden accepted it into workshop. He suggested to sit down. I offered some water. Maurice accepted, and the other. He was thin, not very tall, with slender arms and intelligent gray eyes. He was about 45, his face smooth, almost without wrinkles. Voice quiet and even, a purse of a person who is used to that is listened to, not because that he is shouting, but because he can set it on fire. He said that he had come on behalf of Archbishop Vernon, not the king, the archbishop. The Church of the Most Holy Flame is concerned rumors from the north, rumors about an fire, about gunpowder for must should exist, about person who does things contrary the provisions of Clement. Aidan listened calmly. He was waiting this visit. He knew that it was late the church will come. Better early, better one inquisitor than 10. Maurice spoke for a long time, about Saint Clement the Fiery, on that how 400 years ago he discovered the secret of combustion and sealed that knowledge away, about how the church guards the seal, about how anyone who tries to break the seal becomes a heretic, not out of the church's malice, but according to the will of Clement himself, who knew that the world might not survive a second time. Aidan listened and felt something shift in his mind. St. Clement's, 400 years ago. He discovered the secret of combustion. He sealed away that knowledge. It didn't sound like the story of a saint. It sounded like the story of a man who knew something he wasn't supposed to know, just like Aidan himself. He asked Maurice what exactly Clemens had sealed away. Maurice replied that it was a secret of the church. Aidan nodded. He didn't press the issue. Not yet. Instead, he suggested showing Maurice something. They went out into the courtyard. Aidan took a handful of gunpowder. He poured it onto a stone. He held a splinter of wood to it. The gunpowder flared up, a bright white fire, a sharp crack, a wisp of smoke. Maurice watched without blinking. Aidan asked if he saw an impure flame here. Maurice remained silent. Aidan explained. Saltpeter, a potassium salt that contains within itself the air necessary for combustion. Coal, pure carbon. Sulfur, a binding agent that lowers the ignition temperature. 3 substances, none of them is cursed, none is summoned by a spell, none requires a pact with darkness. This is chemistry, not magic. Maurice listened. His expression didn't change, but his hands, which he'd been holding clasped across his chest, relaxed slightly. Aidan continued. He asked Maurice if he knew what willow bark was. Maurice nodded. A remedy for fever. Aidan asked if the church considered willow bark heresy. Maurice replied that it did not. Aidan asked why. After all, willow bark relieves fever better than prayer. Isn't that an interference with the divine order? Maurice opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again. He said it wasn't the same thing. Aidan replied that it was exactly the same thing. Knowledge. Just knowledge. One kind of knowledge heals, another kills. But even a knife can heal and kill. After all, the church doesn't ban knives. Maurice was silent for a long time, a very long time. Then he quietly asked if gunpowder had a soul. Aidan thought for a moment, for a second. Then he replied that he feared gunpowder had only a formula, just like both of them. Maurice didn't smile, but something shifted in his eyes. Some kind of wall cracked. They talked until nightfall. Maurice asked questions, lots of questions. Not about gunpowder, about Litany d'Ivor, about the people, about why Aidan was teaching the peasants to read and write, about why the herbalist and the alchemist were signing treatises together, about why a 12-year-old girl was a better treasurer than the treasurer himself. Aidan answered, honestly, without tricks. He didn't try to convert the inquisitor to his beliefs. He simply showed him things as they were. In the morning, Maurice left, alive, just as Aidan had promised. but his face was pale. Pale not from fear, but from understanding. He had seen the future, and the future had no need for his church. Or perhaps it did, but for a very different church. Cale asked Aidan why he had let the Inquisitor go. He'd return with soldiers. Aidan shook his head. He said that Maurice would return, but not with soldiers. He would return with questions. And a person who asks questions isn't an enemy. He's a potential ally. Cale disagreed, but he said nothing. Iris didn't leave the barracks until evening, when she found out the Inquisitor had left. Her hands were still trembling. Aidan approached her and said that Maurice wouldn't lay a finger on her. Never. As long as the foundry stands, no one will lay a finger on her. Iris looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She had long since forgotten how to cry. But there was something in them that Aidan hadn't seen before. Trust. Not blind trust. Hard-won trust. She said quietly that she believed him. Aidan didn't know what to say. He just stood there beside her. That was enough. 2 weeks after Maurice's departure, the first news arrived from the capital. Selina received a letter from one of her contacts. The news was bad. The king knew. Not everything, but enough. He knew Aidan was alive. He knew Aidan had men. He knew about the strange gunpowder. Someone had ratted them out. One of the merchants, or someone who'd passed through Copper Hill, or someone who'd heard the gunshots in the forest. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that Anselm had sent a punitive expedition. 300 men, cavalry and infantry, under the command of Count Alaric Haldan. Aidan knew that name. Haldan was an old enemy, a courtier, the very one who had whispered to the king about the impure fire. Experienced, brave, honest in his own way. A man for whom the knightly cavalry was not a tactic, but a faith. He was heading north with 300 horsemen and infantrymen, absolutely certain that the campaign would last a week. Ride up, surround, capture, execute. Return in time for dinner. Aidan stood over the map and calculated. 300 men. It would take them 2 weeks to reach Letany Dvor, maybe 3 if the roads were washed out. He had 10 cannons. No, 7. 3 weren't ready yet. 7 cannons, 15 arquebuses, 50 men. 30 of them were combat ready. Of those 30, 7 were experienced soldiers. The numbers didn't add up. Cale stood nearby. He was looking at the map. His face was calm, not cold, calm. The face of a man who had seen battle before, who knew that numbers aren't everything. He said the position was good. The valley was narrow. There was only one approach, hills on both sides. If the cannons were positioned correctly, then 300 men weren't just 300 men. They were a target. Uthem had 2 weeks. Aidan spent the first day on calculations. I sat, working the map with Cale and Selina, to late, I counted the distances, the angles of fire, reload time, number of rounds, number cores, number of explosive projectiles. In had 7 cannons, 22 high-explosive shells, 140 conventional stone cannonballs, 15 arquebuses with a supply of gunpowder for 200 shots, 30 combat-ready people, out of whom 7 were able to shoot. The rest knew how to reload. That should be enough, if everything goes plan. Cale has taken his positions, 4 cannons on the left hill, 3 on right, crossfire on road, arrows with arquebuses on the rampart in front of the gates of the yard, the second row behind the walls, reserve of 10 people with swords and axes against, just in case, if the enemy breaks through. Aidan added his 2 cents. The galled of buckshot, not cannonballs, small bags with small lead balls. When firing, they scatter in a fan shape. Against a tight formation of cathro or cavalry, this mows down the ranks like a sickle wheat. He fired shotgun 3 days. Taya helped. She measured out the lead. She counted the number of beads in each bag. 32 balls per charge. 16 bags per 7 cannons, plus regular cannonballs, plus high explosive shells.
She believed, and her hands didn't tremble. Aidan wanted say to so that she leave. What her 13 years and this not her war. But he didn't say. That's that it was her war. With that day, since it brought him water at the bridge. From that day, since she began to consider gunpowder, she deserved the right to be here. Iris was setting up the infirmary. Bandages from torn shirts, rubbing alcohol from distillation still, ointments, decoctions, willow bark. It's antiseptic from the root without name. She was getting ready for the wounded. For her wounded. Her hands moved quickly and precisely, but Aidan saw that she had turned pale. No out of fear of the battle, out of fear of fire. Cannons is fire. Gunpowder is fire. Everything around it was fire, and she ran away the fire her life. He approached to her in the evening. He sat next to her. I didn't say a word. I just sat there. Iris remained silent. Then quietly she said that when the monastery was, she stood on the hill and looked. She stood and couldn't move. The fire devoured the walls, the roof, the library where she spent 10 years. People who taught her. She stood and watched, and nothing could do. Aidan listened. He interrupted. When she fell silent, he said just one thing. That this fire will different. This fire protects, and does burns. Iris looked at him, for a long time. Then she nodded. No, because that she believed it. But that I decided to try to believe. Selina worked in her own way. She sent messengers to 3 barons. She did not with a request for help, with information. The royal detachment is toward north, 300 men. If they pass across the land's barons, then they'll take fodder and the horses. As always, no asking, without payment. This was not a call of rebellion. It was a reminder about what the build of the crown. 2 barons did not answer. The 3rd sent 5 barrels of mixture, dirty, weak, but gunpowder is gunpowder. Aidan cleaned out it in 2 days, added to my supplies. Mir Khan in Latany courtyard more had yet, but Orden, for those months, has grown into a master whose Aidan had not expected. The blacksmith had been the last 3 cannon barrels by himself, according to the drawings. With precision that year ago was unavailable, unattainable. His hands had learned what uniform wall thickness felt like. His eyes had learned to spot defects in the castings. 3 barrels were ready a week ahead of schedule. 10 cannons, a full set. Halden was traveling along the northern road. Selina was receiving reports through her people. 320 men, 130 cavalry. The rest were infantry. A supply train of 20 wagons. A catapult. An old one, but it worked. A mage. 1. From the Tower of Ash. A mid-rank fire mage. Kale asked about the mage. Aidan said that a single fire mage wasn't a problem. Mages from the Tower of Ash have a range of 50 paces. His cannons have a range of 500. If the mage gets within 50 paces, he's already dead. Kale nodded. For the first time ever, he looked calm. Not tensely calm. Truly calm. He believed in their position. He believed in the cannons. He believed in the man who had made them. They arrived on the 14th day, in the morning.
Fog lay in the valley. A sentry on the hill spotted a column on the road and sounded the alarm. A single shot from an arquebus into the air. The foundry yard awoke. The men took their positions, without panic. They'd rehearsed this for 10 days. Everyone knew where to go.
Everyone knew what to do. Taya was in the powder magazine. She measured out the charges. She passed them to the loaders. Tane carried the cannonballs to their positions. Iris waited in the infirmary. Derek stood at the gate with a notebook. Aiden didn't understand why he'd brought a notebook to the battle. Then he understood. Derek was going to take notes. Everything. For history. Aiden stood on the hill to the right, next to 3 cannons, with a spyglass. The only one in Latany Devor. A gift from Selena, bought at the Southern Fair for an exorbitant price. He looked out at the road. Halden's column emerged from the fog. Beautiful, even. The banners of the crown, the gleam of armor, horses in caparisons, cavalry in front, infantry behind them. The supply train brought up the rear. 320 men against 50. Halden rode at the head, on a white horse, in full armor bearing the coat of arms, visor raised. He was a brave man. Aiden had known that all along. Cale stood on the hill to the left, with 4 cannons, waiting for the signal. The signal was simple, a red flag. Raised meant open fire. Aiden waited. The column was entering the valley. The road narrowed between the hills. Halden didn't stop. He didn't send out scouts. He was marching on the heretics' village. What could possibly go wrong? He didn't know what a cannon was. No one in this world, except for a handful of people in Latany Devor, knew what a cannon was. The column entered the firing range. 300 paces. 250. 200. Aiden raised the red flag. The first volley. 7 cannons fired simultaneously. 4 on the left, 3 on the right. Shotgun pellets at the head of the column. Cannonballs at the center. The sound was so deafening that birds fell from the trees. The ground shook. Smoke blanketed the valley. When it cleared, Aiden saw it. The head of the column no longer existed. The front ranks of the cavalry lay on the road, horses and men jumbled together. Some were screaming, some were crawling. The banner had fallen. Halden was on the ground. His horse was dead. He himself was kneeling among the bodies, staring at the hills, at the cannons, with an expression that Aiden would remember forever. Not anger, not fear. Bewilderment, as if the world had broken a rule that must never be broken. Cale gave the order to reload. 30 seconds. The second volley. High explosive shells at the center of the column. Explosions, flashes, the whistling of shrapnel. The infantry ran. Not backward, just to the sides, like ants fleeing boiling water. The third volley. At the supply train. The wagons scattered. The horses of the supply train broke free from their harnesses and bolted away. A mage from the Tower of Ash stood in the middle of the road trying to conjure a fireball. An arquebus bullet struck him in the shoulder from 300 paces away. He fell. The fireball went out. 3 volleys. Less than 3 minutes. Of Halden's 320 men, perhaps 100 were still on their feet. The rest were lying down, or running, or crawling. Halden stood, alone, amid the bodies, without a horse, without a banner, sword in hand. He looked at the hill where Aiden stood. Through his spyglass, Aiden could see his eyes. There was no hatred in them, only that same bewilderment. The world had fallen apart, and Count Halden didn't understand how. Aiden did not order a 4th volley. He raised a white flag. Cale turned toward him. He asked with a single glance. Aiden shook his head.
Enough. Cale clenched his teeth, but he obeyed. Of the 320, about 40 had survived. Halden did not survive. They found him on the road, dead. A shrapnel fragment from an explosive shell. In the neck. He died standing up, with a sword in his hand, like a knight. Aiden ordered him to be buried with honors, separately from the rest, with his sword, with his coat of arms. Cale asked why. Aiden replied that Halden was an enemy, but an honorable enemy. He came openly, with his visor raised. He deserved a proper grave. Cale said nothing. Taya stood by the powder magazine. She watched as Cale's soldiers dragged the bodies off the road. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She looked at Aiden, at his face, and she saw what she had seen the first time he killed the bandits by the bridge. Victory made him sick. He was sitting on a cannon carriage, hands on his knees, head bowed, a victor who felt sick at his own victory. Iris came out of the infirmary. There were no wounded at the foundry courtyard, not a single one. All the casualties were on the other side. She walked over to Aiden, stood beside him, placed her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd ever touched him. Aiden didn't lift his head, but his breathing evened out. Valarin learned the word artillery. After the battle in Valley, peace around the foundry yard has changed. 40 surviving soldiers from Halden spread the news through all of Valarin. The stories were confusing, wild. Some said about iron on the hills, other about hellish fire which falls from the sky. The third about something that the alchemist sold his soul and summoned demons. Its true was simpler and more terrifying. 10 bronze pipes, powder made manure and ash, and a person who knows count. To Litany Yard people. Not by 2 and in 3 as before. By the dozens. Peasants at whom had land. Artisans who were crushed by taxes. Soldiers who were not salaries. Junior officers who saw how execute the innocent and remained silent. And any more did want to remain silent. For 2 months after the battle, the population of Litany Yard grew to 120 people. Aiden had to build it. Barracks, warehouses, a second smithy, a second gunpowder mill, palisade around the entire village. Cale organized the construction as military operation. Shifts by 8 hours. Every man works. Every woman works. The children help out. No one is sitting. Aiden introduced a rule. Every new person goes through Derek. He is learning to read, writing, counting up to 1,000, then passes through Teyu. He learns to weigh, measuring, recording the result. Then, after Kayla, command, commands, discipline. Then after Iris, hygiene, rinsing of wounds, boiling water for drinking. Only after this does a person is the position. Selena was watching at it, and for the first time called Litany courtyard, that word that Aiden hasn't had. She said, that state, small, crooked, in the forest, but the state, according to the rules, with order, with people who know why they are here. Aiden replied that it not country, it's workshop, it's just big. Selena smiled and didn't said. She knew better. At the beginning, they came Hana Cho. She arrived not on foot and not on mule, on 4 carts loaded goods, on 3 guards. 2 of them were former mercenaries from the south. The third was her cousin brother, whom she called simply Cho, and who said little but ate a lot. Hana was dark-skinned, lively, with a quick smile and eyes that thought everything around faster than Taya. She appreciated Foundry Courtyard for half a day. I took a walk through the workshops. I took a look at cannons, at the supplies, at people. I counted something in her head, then came to Aiden and said, She has caravans. He has goods of which no one is be know. She suggests to work together. Aiden asked what she wanted. Hana replied that she wants that from was taken. Her family was ruined by a decree on monopoly on saltpeter. Father died from a stroke a month after ruin. Her mother left to relatives to the south. The brothers scattered. Hana was left alone, with the caravan, with 3 people, and with stubbornness. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to work, build, to trade, to live like, as I thought, right, without a king who, by a single decree, erases entire families. Aiden looked at her and saw something that recognized more. A person cast out by the system, like he himself, just like Iris, just like Kale, like Selena, like everyone else here. He agreed. Hana took it upon herself to supply as personal war. For the first month, she established 3 routes. Southern, through the Khanates, sulfur, spices, and cloth. The eastern route, through small principalities, lead and tin. The western route, through the free cities, cast iron, copper, and bronze. Each route went through intermediaries. No direct contacts, no traces. The goods were disguised as ordinary trade, sulfur as a pharmaceutical product, lead as raw material for roofers, copper as raw material for boilers. No one asked questions when the goods moved in small batches through 10 different hands. Kana knew this. She grew up in a family that had been in the trade for generations. She knew how to hide cargo in plain sight. The first thing she did for Aiden personally was to make him eat. She came into the workshop where he was poring over blueprints at midnight. She set a bowl of hot porridge and a mug of broth in front of him. She told him he'd forgotten to eat. Aiden looked at the bowl, then at Hana. She stood with her arms crossed, waiting. She didn't leave. He realized she wouldn't leave until he ate. He ate. The porridge had butter and pieces of dried meat in it. It was hot, delicious. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything other than bread and soup. Hana nodded. She said she'd bring it every evening. Aiden wanted to object. He didn't. In the middle of summer, Mir Khan arrived. She shared Hana's surname, though they weren't related. Mir was 22 years old. She was the daughter of a foundryman from the neighboring principality of Targon. Her father cast bells and cauldrons and was considered the best craftsman in the region. Mir wanted to cast metal too. Her father wouldn't let her. He said a girl at the furnace was trouble, that metal didn't like women's hands, that her place was at the spinning wheel. Mir left home at 20. She worked as an apprentice for 3 different blacksmiths. All 3 fired her after a month. Not because she did a poor job, because she worked better than they did, and they could sense it. She heard about the foundry yard, a place where an alchemist takes on anyone, where skill matters more than gender, where people are judged by what they do, not by who they were born to be. She went there and asked to be taken on as an apprentice. Aiden looked at her hands. Burned forearms, calluses in all the right places, fingers that knew a hammer. He took her to the forge, gave her a piece of metal, told her to show him what she could do. Mir took the hammer, and Orden, who was standing behind Aiden, whistled for the first time ever. She worked beautifully, precisely. Every blow landed exactly where it was supposed to. The metal obeyed her hands as if she were talking to it, not with brute force, but with understanding. Aiden gave her a blueprint of a cannon barrel. He told her to study it. Meyer studied it for 3 days. She asked questions. Sharp questions. Specific ones. Why is it thicker here? Why is it thinner here? Why are the trunnions placed at this exact distance from the breech? Aiden answered, and with every answer he saw the same flame ignite in her eyes that he'd seen in Tay's when she was calculating. The flame of understanding. A month later, Meyer cast her first barrel, all by herself, from start to finish. Aiden inspected it, tapped it, listened to it, measured the wall thickness, looked for cavities. There were no cavities. The thickness was even. The trunnions were in place. The barrel was better than the ones cast by Gareth of Copper Hill. Aiden looked at Meyer. She stood before him, covered in soot and sweat, her hands scorched, waiting for his verdict. He said it was the best barrel ever cast at the foundry yard. Meyer didn't smile. She just nodded, as if she'd known it even before he said it. Then she smiled, widely, openly. It was the first time in front of him. He inscribed her name on the cannon's brand, Meyer Khan, the first cannon cast entirely by her own hands. She saw the brand and froze. She stared at it for a long time. She traced the letters with her fingers. Then she turned to Aiden and said directly, without preamble, "I like you. Say yes or no." "I don't like waiting." Aiden opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was used to Selena's subtle hints, to Iris's silent warmth, to Hannah's businesslike, caring attention, to Tay's quiet adoration. But he wasn't used to this. He was at a loss for half a minute. Then he laughed, for the first time in a long time. Meyer frowned. She asked if she'd said something funny. Aiden shook his head. He said no. He just hadn't heard anything so direct from people in a long time. He didn't say yes to her. He didn't say no. He said he'd answer when all this was over. Meyer shrugged. She said she'd wait, even though she didn't like waiting. By fall, the foundry yard had become what Aiden had envisioned it to be a year ago. Standing over a map in a small workshop in Thornford, a fortress workshop, 50 men under arms, 20 cannons, a gunpowder mill, the foundry yard, a school, an infirmary, warehouses, a palisade and ramparts, people who could read, count, and shoot, people who knew why they were there. Aiden stood on the wall and looked south. There, beyond the forests and hills, sat on a throne a man who thought his former alchemist had long been dead. He was wrong. The alchemist was alive, and the alchemist had something no one else in this world possessed. Not cannons, not gunpowder. People, who didn't believe in him, but in what he was building. For the first time, Aiden said it out loud. The Free District. Selena heard him. She nodded. She said, "Finally." Cale heard it. He clenched his fist. He said it was long overdue. Iris heard it. She smiled, quietly, with just her eyes. Taya heard it. She wrote it down in her journal. Date, name, the Free District. Date of founding, year 1, day 283 of the exile. Winter of the second year was different. Not hungry, not dark. Hannah set up supplies so that to the warehouses there was grain for 4 months ahead. Orden and Meyer painted barrels without stopping. In the middle winter in the district, there were 30 cannons, 200 arquebuses. A mill operated around the day for 2 shifts. Taya managed gunpowder production. She was 14. Under her command there were 12 people. The adult men were her orders without objections. That is why, because she didn't once was in her not, Aiden checked every batch. Every time the numbers converged up, the last penny. He stopped check by February. It's just that he signed her reports without looking at them. Taya noticed. She didn't say anything, but something warm flashed in her eyes, an acknowledgement. Not his, her own. She finally believed that she was truly doing this, that she wasn't just an assistant, that she was a master. 230 people now lived in the district. Cale had set up a full-fledged military structure, 3 rifle companies of 50 men each, an artillery unit of 20 gunners, a reconnaissance unit of 10 mounted scouts, and an engineering detachment of 15 men who built fortifications and roads. Every rifleman underwent training, 4 weeks, drill, reloading, aiming, volley on command.
Cale pushed them to the limit. But he didn't hit them. He didn't humiliate them. Aiden had forbidden it. In the district, they don't hit their own. Never. Cale accepted this rule in silence, but Aiden could see how hard it was for him. He'd grown up in an army where physical punishment was the norm, where a sergeant had the right to strike a private for a wrong turn. Cale was learning a new way, learning to command with words, and discovering that it worked better. Selena led the negotiations. The 3 barons had finally made up their minds. 2 of them had openly sworn allegiance to the district. The 3rd remained neutral, but secretly sent silver. The minor nobility of the western provinces whispered among themselves. Merchants in the free cities calculated which side offered greater profit. Valarin was bursting at the seams. Taxes were rising. The harvest had been meager for the 3rd year in a row. The roads were falling apart. The soldiers weren't being paid. Anselm sat in the capital, afraid of his own shadow. After Haldan's death, he hadn't appeared before the people for 3 days. Then he came out and announced that the heretic in the northern forests would be destroyed, that he was sending a new army. 5,000 men, half of the crown's total forces. The news reached the district in March. Selena brought the letter. Aiden read it. 5,000. His expression didn't change. He placed the letter on the table. He looked at Cale. Cale was standing by the door, his face stony. 5,000 isn't 300. You can't just sit behind walls against 5,000. They'll tear down the walls. They'll bypass them. They'll wear us down. Against 5,000, we have to take the fight to the open field. Cale said this out loud. Aiden nodded. He knew. He'd been preparing for this for half a year. Not for a defense, for open field combat. For the first real battle where the cannons would stand not on the hills but in the open. Where the riflemen would fire not from behind walls but from the ranks. Where everything would be decided not by geography but by tactics. He took out a map, spread it out on the table, pointed to a spot. The Chernovodny Ford, a 3-day march south of the district. A river, a ford. The only crossing for 20 versts in either direction. If we meet them here at the crossing, those 5,000 will become the ones wading through the water under fire. Cale stared at the map. His eyes lit up. He saw the position. The river is a line. The ford is a bottleneck. Cannons on the bank, archers on the flanks. This isn't a battle. It's a massacre. Aiden said, no, not a massacre. He doesn't want another Haldan. He doesn't want 1,000 corpses at the crossing. He wants them to run. Cale asked how to make 5,000 men run. Aiden replied, show them something they've never seen before. High explosive shells on the supply train in the rear. Cannon fire on the vanguard at the crossing. Simultaneously. The army is in a vice. Death ahead.
Explosions behind. The river on either side. The only way out is back. They'll run, not because they're cowards, because they're human. They'd been preparing for a month. Aiden calculated every shot, every angle, every second. Taya sat beside him and checked his numbers. Sometimes she'd correct him. He wasn't surprised anymore. Meyer was casting the last barrels. She worked 20 hours a day. Orden worked beside her. They didn't speak. They just hammered. In unison. 2 hammers, 2 people.
1 task. Iris was preparing a supply of medicine. This time there would be wounded. Her own people. She knew it. She was preparing. Her hands no longer trembled when she heard the word fire. Kana had arranged for transportation. 20 wagons, horses, oxen, gunpowder, cannonballs, shells, food, bandages, and water. Everything an army needs when it marches into the field. 800 men. The district had grown over the winter. People had come from the barons' estates. Volunteers had come from the villages. Former soldiers had come, men tired of serving a crown that didn't pay. 800 riflemen, 30 cannons, against 5,000. Aiden stood on the bank of the Chernovodnaya and looked at the water. Cold, fast-flowing, dark with peat. A good bank. High. From it, the ford is visible 500 paces away. He positioned the cannons, 20 on the bank, 10 with Kale on the flanking maneuver. Kale will lead a detachment of 200 men and 10 cannons through the forest. He'll emerge behind the Royal Army's lines. He'll strike the supply train. Simultaneously with a volley at the ford, a pincer movement. They'd been waiting for 3 days. The Royal Army arrived on the 4th. 5,000. Banners. Dust. The thunder of thousands of feet on the road. General Warren rode at the head. Not a knight like Halden, a soldier, gray-haired, tough, cautious. He halted the army a verst from the ford. He sent out scouts. The scouts saw an empty bank. Aiden had hidden everything. Cannons behind earthen ramparts, men in trenches, no fire, no smoke, no sound. The scouts returned. They reported that the way was clear. Warren didn't believe them, but he had the king's orders to advance, to take the crossing, and not to stop. The vanguard entered the water, 1,000 men waist-deep in the icy river, wet, defenseless, and slow. Aiden raised his hand and lowered it. 20 cannons fired simultaneously. The grape shot flew over the water and struck the vanguard. 1,000 men in the river, soaked, waist-deep, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The first volley mowed down the first 3 rows. Men fell into the water. The river turned red 10 paces from the shore. The second volley, 30 seconds later, stone cannonballs rained down on the dense mass at the ford. Each cannonball pierced right through the ranks, taking 3 or 4 men with it. The vanguard faltered. The rear ranks pressed forward. Those in front tried to turn around. A stampede ensued. Men fell into the water and drowned under the weight of their armor. A third volley, high explosive shells. Explosions above the water, shrapnel, flashes, screams. And at that moment, Kale struck from the forest behind the Royal Army. 10 cannons fired at the supply train, simultaneously. The wagons burst into flames. The supply train's horses bolted through the infantry ranks. Panic began at the rear and swept toward the front. 5,000 men found themselves trapped. Ahead lay the river and death. Behind them, fire and explosions. To the right, the forest. To the left, a swamp. Warren tried to keep the formation together. His voice was drowned out by the roar. He was a good general, an experienced one, but he had never faced artillery before. No one in this world had. He didn't know what to do.
because in his military experience, there had never been a situation where you were being killed from a distance you couldn't outrun. The fourth volley. The fifth.
Kale fired relentlessly from the forest. The supply train was on fire. The gunpowder in the wagons exploded once, then twice. Pillars of fire and smoke rose above the forest. The royal army fled, not backward, not forward, to the sides. Some into the forest, some along the shore. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Aiden stood on the shore and looked through his spyglass. His face was impassive. He was counting. Volleys, hits, casualties, time. In his mind, the battle was a problem to solve. Each variable was a living person he had to bring home. His own men. As for the enemy, he had to force them to flee. Not kill them. Force them to flee. He raised a white flag after the seventh volley. Ceasefire. Kale, in the woods, saw the signal. He stopped. Silence fell over the valley. A strange silence, deafening after the roar of the cannons. Bodies lay on the river and on the road. Many. Too many for 7 volleys. The water at the ford was dark. The bank was pockmarked with craters. Warren stood on the road, alone, without a horse, with a broken banner in his hand. Around him stood perhaps 300 men, out of 5,000. The rest had fled, or were lying dead, or had surrendered. Aiden made his way down to the river. He crossed the ford. The water was cold. He walked among the bodies and didn't look down. He couldn't. He approached Warren. The general was wounded, a shrapnel fragment in his left shoulder. Blood was running down his arm. He stood there looking at Aiden, and there was no hatred in his eyes. There was weariness, the endless weariness of an old soldier who realized that everything he'd fought for over the past 30 years had just become meaningless. Aiden told him the battle was over, that the wounded would be tended to, that the prisoners wouldn't be executed, that anyone who laid down their weapons was free to leave. Warren looked at him. Then he lowered the broken banner. He thrust the pole into the ground. He turned to his 300 men. He ordered them to lay down their weapons. They did so, silently, without shame, with relief. Iris arrived with the medical team an hour later. 15 people, stretchers, bandages, rubbing alcohol, ointments. They treated everyone, friends and foes alike. Iris was bandaging a wounded royal soldier, and he looked at her with such bewilderment, as if he couldn't believe that the enemy was treating his wounds. She told him there were no enemies here. There were wounded. Aiden stood on the shore and looked out at the battlefield. 300 dead, maybe 400. The rest had fled or surrendered. The district's losses? 11 wounded, not a single casualty. Victory. Absolute. He felt sick. He stepped behind a tree and threw up. Taya saw it. She came over, held out a flask of water, silently, just like back then by the bridge. The same mug, the same silence, the same understanding. She didn't offer comfort, didn't say everything would be all right. She just stood there beside him, and that was enough. Kale came from the other side of the river. He reported. The supply train had been destroyed, no casualties. 10 cannons were intact. Then he looked at Aiden, at his pale face, at his trembling hands, and said quietly, "Magister, you've just won the war." Aiden shook his head. He said he hadn't won the war. He'd won a battle. The war will end when the capital's gates are opened. And when they are opened, not by cannons, but of their own free will. Kale clenched his teeth. He wanted to object. He wanted to say that free will is weakness, that enemies must be finished off, that Anselm won't open the gates voluntarily. But he remained silent,
because in the year and a half he'd spent alongside this man, he'd learned one thing. Aiden is rarely wrong, and never on the essentials. News of the rout at the Blackwater Ford spread throughout Valarin within a week. 5,000 men, the Crown's finest army, crushed in 20 minutes by a handful of archers and bronze trumpets. Anselm learned of this during dinner. According to the courtiers, he rose from the table and retired to his chambers. He did not emerge for 3 days. On the 4th day, he summoned a man known at court as the Chancellor in Grey, a man whom no one had ever seen up close. The Chancellor in Grey arrived to Aiden himself, not with the army, not with the inquisitors, alone, on foot, in grey cloak with a hood. He stopped him on the road. He introduced himself, the king. Cale wanted to arrest him. Aiden forbade it. He said, let him in. They met in the workshop, in the evening, by the light oil lamp. The Chancellor sat on a stool. His hood was pulled down, his face in shadow. The voice is quiet, steady, without emotion. He said that had come to propose peace. Anselm is ready to acknowledge Free District, ready to give it autonomy, territory, rights, trade privileges. In exchange, Aiden remains in his forests. He goes to capital, doesn't touches the crown. He lives as he wants. He builds whatever he wants, just far away. Aiden listened. He was silent. He thought. The sentence was generous, suspiciously generous. He asked why. The Chancellor replied that war is detrimental for both sides, that the Empire, Otrand, is amassing strength in the east, what southern Khanates are raising their heads, that Valarin not can afford a war when enemies stand at the borders. Aiden asked where the Chancellor knows about Otrand. The Chancellor smiled. Aiden didn't see the smile in shadow of the hood, but I heard her in voice. The Chancellor said that he knows a lot, more than any person in the courtyard, because that he at this inn for a long time, for a very long time. Aiden felt a chill, not physical, an inner chill. Something in the Chancellor's Chancellor was off. Familiar. Not familiar from memory Aiden the alchemist, familiar from that other memory. To that one came at the night in a wagon. He asked the Chancellor to take off his hood. The Chancellor remained silent. Then he slowly raised his hands. He pulled back the cloth. The light from the fell on his face. Aiden stopped breathing. He was looking at his own face, older than 30 years, wrinkles, gray temples, a scar on his chin that Aiden didn't have. But the eyes were the same. The color, the shape, and something behind them. The same foreign memory, the same library of formulas and blueprints, only older, deeper, darker. The Chancellor said, "Hello, Adam." Aiden didn't understand. Or perhaps he did, but refused to accept it. The Chancellor explained, slowly, patiently, the way you explain to a child something the child isn't ready to hear. Their name is Adam Crow, both of them, one person, a chemical engineer. He died of a heart attack in his own laboratory, in another world, in another life, and ended up here, in the body of Aiden Crow, the court alchemist, almost a namesake. It happened twice. The first time was 40 years ago. The Chancellor was the first. He ended up in this body as a young man, 20 years old, with the same memories, with the same formulas, with the same knowledge of gunpowder, metallurgy, and chemistry. He faced the same choice, to build or to infiltrate. He chose to infiltrate. He joined the court, became an advisor, then chancellor. He used his knowledge not for cannons, but for influence, for control, for power. He didn't build a single cannon. He built a system under which no one else could build a cannon. The law on unpure fire, the ban on purifying saltpeter, control over sulfur, all of this was his doing. He sealed away the knowledge, just as St. Clemens had done before him, because he knew what would happen if that knowledge were set free. War, fire, death on a scale this world could not survive. Aidan listened and felt the ground slipping away beneath his feet. The chancellor wasn't lying. He could feel it, with the part of himself that was Adam. He recognized it, the way of speaking, the logic, the way of constructing arguments. It was him, a version of himself who had made a different choice. He asked why the chancellor had banished him. The chancellor answered simply, because he saw himself in him, young, with burning eyes, with notebooks full of formulas, with the belief that knowledge is freedom. The chancellor knew how it would end, because he himself had walked that path. And at the end of the path lies not freedom, it lies in ashes. Aidan asked, why ashes? The chancellor looked at him for a long time. Then he said, because Clemens the Fiery is no saint. He is the third of them. The third was Adam Crow, 400 years ago. And he too built cannons, and he too wanted freedom. And he got a war that scorched half the continent. The Church of the Radiant Flame was built on the ashes of his war. Sealed knowledge is not a whim of fanatics. It is a scar. Aidan was silent for a long time, a very long time. The lamp crackled. The wind howled outside the workshop wall. Somewhere in the distance, Orden was hammering. Meyer was hammering beside him. Iris was sorting herbs. Taya was counting gunpowder. Hannah was checking the supply train. Kale was standing on the wall. 230 people lived, toiled, and worked because Aidan had given them a purpose, and that purpose was built on knowledge that had already burned the world twice. He looked at the chancellor, at his own aging face, and said, no. The chancellor raised an eyebrow. Aidan explained. Clemens built cannons for himself. The chancellor built power for himself. Both made decisions for others. Both sealed away knowledge because they feared others couldn't handle it. But Aidan isn't building for himself. He's building for Tay, who calculates more accurately than he does. For Meyer, who casts spells better than he does. For Iris, who heals better than he does. For Derek, who teaches better than he does. He doesn't seal away knowledge. He shares it, to anyone who is willing to learn. The difference isn't in the gunpowder. The difference is who the gunpowder is for. If knowledge belongs to one person, it becomes a weapon. If knowledge belongs to everyone, it becomes a tool. The chancellor listened. His expression didn't change. Then he said quietly, Clemens said the same thing, in the beginning. Aidan replied, Clemens didn't leave his students behind. He left the church. The church isn't the students. The church is a fortress for knowledge, and the students are the keys. The chancellor was silent. He stood up. He pulled up his hood. He said he was giving Aidan a month. In a month, Anselm would send everything that remained. Not 5,000, everything. Every soldier, every mage, every knight. Either Aiden would accept the offer, or there would be a war that would burn Valarin just as it had been burned twice before. He left. He vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there. Aiden sat in his workshop until dawn, alone, thinking. In the morning, he went out to his people. He gathered everyone. He told them the truth, the whole truth, about the Chancellor, about Clemens, about who he really was, about the foreign memory in his head, about how he wasn't just an alchemist, but a man from another world, placed into this body at the moment of death. The silence was so thick you could hear a fish splashing in the river. Then Taya said, "It doesn't change anything. He's still the one who taught her to count, still the one who gave her a name, not her mother's name, not the village's name, but her own name. Taya West, master of the gunpowder mill." What difference does it make where the memory came from if the hands that taught her were his? Iris nodded. Cale clenched his fist and nodded. Meyer shrugged and said she didn't care which world he was from as long as the guns fired. Hannah said she had caravans, and that caravans didn't move on their own, and that it was time for them all to wrap up the meeting and get to work. Selena was the last to speak. She looked at Aiden for a long time. Then she said, "If you give up the crown, I'll stay. If you accept it, I'll stay too. Just for different reasons." Aiden exhaled, for the first time that night. A month passed faster than Aiden wanted. He spent it on training. He didn't for defense, for a campaign. Cale was right for half a year ago. You can't wait until the enemy arrives. You must go to it. The district put up 800 riflemen, 30 cannons, 120 wagons in the convoy. Hannah organized the supply for 3 weeks of the march. Meyer and Orden cast the last barrels. They checked each one. We tapped them. We listened to them. Not a single defects. Taya prepared a supply. 10,000 charges for arquebuses, 1,200 for cannons, 400 high-explosive shells. Everything has been counted. Everything has been weighed. Everything is packed. Iris has gathered a field hospital, 30 stretchers, bandages, rubbing alcohol, ointments, splints for fractures. She taught 12 paramedics from among those who could shoot. Women, elderly people, teenagers. Everyone knew what to do with wound. Everyone knew how to bandage it. Everyone knew that hands should. This Iris taught first. Always first. Derek stayed in Latany Yard, with a note, with instructions, with authority to manage in Aiden's Aiden. He turned pale when he read it. He said he was just a scribe. Aiden replied that he wasn't. He was a keeper of records, a keeper of knowledge. If Aiden didn't return, everything he knew would remain in the notebooks Derek had kept. Every formula, every drawing, every process, recorded, copied, organized on shelves. Knowledge won't die with a single person. That's the whole difference. Clemens took his knowledge to the grave. The Chancellor locked his in a safe. Aiden left copies, dozens of copies, in the hands of students who understand what's written. The district's army set out at the beginning of summer, southward, along roads that a year ago had been dangerous due to bandits. Now the roads were clear. The district had brought order to the district. A pun, but true. The first town on the route surrendered without a fight. The small town of Grey Mills, a garrison of 50 men. The commandant stepped outside the gates. He looked at the 30 cannon barrels aimed at the walls. He looked at the 800 riflemen in formation. He took off his helmet. He placed it on the ground. He said he was surrendering the town. Aiden entered Grey Mills and gave his first order. Open the granary. Distribute the grain to the townspeople. The commandant watched this and couldn't understand it. The conqueror was handing out food. It didn't fit into his worldview. The second city, Copper Hill, the very place where Old Man Gareth had cast the first barrels. The garrison numbered 200 men. The city council gathered and voted. Open the gates. Unanimously. Gareth met Aidan at the gate of his workshop. He shook his hand in silence. He said he was glad the barrels had come in handy. The third city, the fourth, the fifth. They marched south, and the cities opened their gates, not because they feared the cannons, because they had heard. In the district, everyone is fed. In the district, no one is burned. In the district, children are taught to read and write. In the district, the herbalist treats people for free. In the district, a blacksmith engraves his name on a cannon. In the district, a man is worth as much as his skills, not as much as his lineage. Rumors spread ahead of the army, and the rumors were true. It was a weapon more powerful than gunpowder. Anselm sent out detachments to meet them, 3 times. The first detachment consisted of 500 men. They saw the cannons, they turned around, they retreated without a fight. The commander lowered the royal colors and led his men into the woods. He didn't desert. He simply decided he didn't want to be caught between the cannons and the wall. The second detachment numbered 1,000 men. They took up a position on a hill by the river. Cale flanked them. He set up the cannons. He fired a single volley over their heads, a warning shot. The detachment commander watched the explosions behind his positions and understood. If the next volley were aimed at them, the detachment would be wiped out. He came out with a white flag. He laid down his weapons. He made a single request, that his men be allowed to return home. Aidan granted it. The third detachment, 2,000 men, Anselm's personal guard, the elite, Valarin's finest soldiers. They were stationed at the bridge across the Cerebrianca River, the last crossing before the capital. Beyond the bridge, it was a 2-day march to the city gates. Cale wanted to repeat the Blackwater Ford. Aidan said no. He went out to the bridge alone, unarmed, wearing an old leather apron over his traveling cloak. The commander of the guard watched him from the bridge, a young man, about 25 years old, in polished armor, with a sword that cost more than Aidan had earned in 7 years at court. Aidan stopped on his side of the bridge. He shouted across the water. He said he didn't want their blood, that the cannons were on the hill behind him, that a single volley would be enough to wipe out the bridge along with everyone standing on it. But he didn't want that volley. He wanted them to leave, to go home, to their families, to their wives and children. The war is over. Anselm has lost, not because his army is weak, because his kingdom is empty. The taxes have been squeezed dry. The people are embittered. The cities are surrendering without a fight. Not to Aidan. Common sense. The young commander stood on the bridge and listened. His soldiers stood behind him and listened. 2,000 men. Silence. Only the river murmured. The commander took off his helmet. He placed it on the bridge railing. He turned to his men. He said something, quietly. Aidan didn't hear what. The guard turned around and left, silently, in formation, with their weapons, but they left. The bridge was left empty. Cale, on the hill, exhaled. Taya, standing next to him, whispered that the master was crazy. Cale replied that he wasn't. He isn't crazy. He just knows people better than they know themselves. 2 days' journey, the capital, white walls, towers, the north gate. Anselm was waiting behind them, the last one, alone. The mages from the Tower of Ash had left at dawn. The courtiers had scattered. The chancellor in grey had vanished. He'd disappeared just as suddenly as he'd arrived, without a trace, without a note. Only in Aidan's office, on the desk, lay a scrap of paper. On it were 2 words in handwriting that Aidan recognized, because it was his own handwriting, only older. 2 words. Don't repeat. Aidan folded the paper. He tucked it into his apron pocket. next to the gunpowder formula, next to the blueprint for the first cannon, next to the note about the Bickford fuse, where Iris's name was listed first. The district army stood in a semicircle on the hill before the northern gates of the capital. 100 cannons, 3,000 riflemen, supply wagons, banners without coats of arms, white, plain, without symbols, because the district does not belong to any one person. It does not belong to a single family. It does not belong to a single faith. Autumn, rain, a gray sky. Aidan stood before the cannons and looked at the gates that had stood for 200 years. Stone, massive, with iron hinges, with the coat of arms of Valarin on the keystone. He raised his hand. One volley, 1 cannons fired at once. A roar engulfed the capital from the wall to wall. The birds took off from the roofs a black cloud. The windows in nearest houses shattered. The northern gates that had stood 200 years have formed inside. The stone and iron and wood crumbled into a cloud of mood. When the dust settled, in the doorway stood a torn light of Anne Day. The rain fell through a hole. Aidan walked across the courtyard of the Rains on foot, alone, without weapons, in old leather apron of an alchemist over a travel cloak. The same apron in which he was 7 years in the court, burnt by acid in 3 places, with stain of saltpeter on left pocket, from his initials embroidered on the inside because that, in the board, the aprons were mixed up. Boots stirred up the mud. The rain soaked my hair. He was Hart and counted his steps. As I counted, he always did, just as I've everything. The courtyard of the Rains was empty. The Rains had laid down their weapons. The servants scattered, the mages left. All that remained only walls, and 1 person on the throne chamber. Aidan entered. The throne hall was huge. High ceilings, stone columns, stained glass windows, half of which were shattered by a volley. Colored lay to the floor like a mosaic. The rain poured through empty window openings. Anselm sat on the throne, alone, without a crown, without a cloak, in plain shirt, hands on armrests, back straight. He was small. Aidan had forgotten how small. Not very tall, narrow-shouldered, with a thin face and sharp, wicked eyes. The eyes stared at Aidan without fear, with something similar, a curiosity. Anselm was waiting death, that was obvious. He braced himself for her. He himself got order. I sat on throne, straightened his back, decided to die as a king. Aidan stopped at 10 steps from the throne. He took off apron, folded it up, put it on floor. Sat down on the step of the throne. He did not on throne, on step, below the king. And he spoke softly. He said that hadn't come for the crown. He came for notebooks. For his notebooks. Behind 3 dissertations. For a treatise on pure salts and slow combustion, which Anselm signed in someone else's name. He wants them back, and he wants talk about that how this kingdom will stop devour its people. Anselm watched at him from above, for a long time, in silence. Then quietly he asked, "Are you joking, or the alchemist? He led an army and 100 cannons and smashed the gate, for the sake of notebooks." Aidan replied that he, for the notebooks. It was that in them is written, for the sake of knowledge, which is not to be belong to a person, not king, nor alchemist, not the church, to no one. Knowledge must be open, schools should be open, workshops must be free, the law on unclean fire must be. And it be such system authorities under which not single of the following Anselm will be able to, by himself, decree, erase a person along with his work. Anselm. He listened. His expression didn't change. He was a smart man, smart enough to realize he'd lost, vain enough to hate that realization, and alive enough to want to stay that way. He asked what would happen to him. Aidan replied, "A trial, a public one, with a defense, with the right to speak. Let the people decide. Not Aidan, the people." Anselm smirked. He said the people would hang him. Aidan replied that it was possible, but it would be the people's decision, not that of a single man. That was the difference between what had been and what would be. Rain was falling outside the window. People entered the hall, one after another. Cale Morn, in armor, with a sword at his belt. He stood by the door, upright, silent. 2 years ago, he had come to the village with 6 soldiers and asked to serve. Now he commanded the army that had torn down the capital's gates. His brother had been avenged, not with a sword, with justice. Selina Weir, in a traveling gown, without fur, without jewelry. She walked across the hall and stood by a column. She looked at the throne where her ancestors had once sat, at the step where the alchemist was sitting, and she nodded, quietly, to herself. Iris Morrow. She was the last of the women to enter, quietly, just as she always did. She looked at the stained glass windows, at the rain, at the colorful shards on the floor. She stopped next to Aidan, close, without touching him, but close, as always. Mir Han. She entered loudly. Her boots clattered on the stone. Hands in her pockets, her sunburned forearms were bare. She looked at the throne, at the king, and at Aidan, and said aloud that the throne room was smaller than she'd thought. Someone behind her snorted. Hana Cho. She entered with a notebook. She was already counting. How many people were in the city? How much grain was in the royal granaries? How much would it take to feed the capital until the next harvest? She smiled at Aidan and said he'd forgotten to eat. Again. Taya West. She was the last to enter. She was 15. Barefoot. No, not barefoot. Not that barefoot girl with a basket of onions. In boots. In a work shirt. With gunpowder stains on her fingers. With a birch bark journal under her arm. For the first time in her life, she was standing in the throne room. She looked around, at the ceilings, at the columns, at the shattered stained glass windows. Then she looked at Aidan, who was sitting on the step of the throne, wet from the rain, with his hands on his knees. She leaned toward Iris and whispered, and he didn't even catch his breath. Iris took her hand, squeezed it. Aidan heard. He smiled, for the first time that day. Then he stood up. He picked up his apron from the floor, put it on, fastened it, turned to his people, to those for whom he had been building, not for himself. For Tay, who calculates more accurately than he does. For Meyer, who pours better than he does. For Iris, who heals better than he does. For Cale, who defends better than he does. For Selina, who thinks further ahead than he does. For Hannah, who drives faster than he does. For Derek, who guards more faithfully than he does. He said, "We're home." Then he turned toward the door and walked away. Not toward the throne, toward the exit, across the courtyard, through the ruined gates, toward his cannons and his people and his workshop which needed to be rebuilt. Right here, in the capital, with open doors. The coronation took place 3 months later, not of his own volition. The district council voted, the cities voted, the barons voted. The people in the squares shouted his name. Aiden refused 6 times. On the 7th time, Taya came to him in his workshop. She placed the crown on the table. She said he could refuse an 8th time, but then someone else would wear the crown, and that someone else would be worse. Because a good king isn't someone who wants the crown. A good king is someone who is sickened by the crown. Aiden looked at the crown, at Taya, at the girl who had brought him water by the bridge 3 years ago, who had grown into a master craftsman, who thought better than he did, who understood people better than he did. She was 15, and she had just told him the wisest thing he'd heard in 2 lifetimes. He put on the crown, under the barrels of 100 cannons, in the square before the ruined gates that he had ordered not to be rebuilt. Let them stand that way, as a reminder that gates can be broken. Any gates. Iris stood in the crowd. She was looking at him. When the crown touched his head, he found her with his eyes. She wasn't smiling. She was crying. For the first time in his presence, quietly, silently, because she knew what he knew. This was not a victory. It was a responsibility. Heavier than any cannon. Heavier than any barrel that Meyer had cast. Heavier than any wagon train that Kana had led. Heavier than anything. That evening, after the coronation, Aiden sat in the former royal laboratory, his old laboratory. The copper distillation cubes stood in the same places. Scales, flasks, retorts. Everything just as it had been 3 years ago. Only dust. 3 years of dust. He sat at his old desk, holding his notebooks in his hands. Anselm had returned them, as promised. 3 dissertations, a treatise, his handwriting, his formulas, his name on the title page. Not someone else's. His. Derek had refused to change it, and for that, he lost everything. And for that, he gained everything. On the desk, next to the notebooks, lay a scrap of paper. 2 words. Don't repeat. Aiden pulled a stub of a pencil from his lab coat pocket. He flipped the paper over. He wrote on the back, "I won't do it again." And he signed it with both names. Aiden Crow. Adam Crow. Both of them. Both real. Rain was falling outside the window. The capital was falling asleep. The first night in 3 years without fear.